Hello everybody, Thersites the Historian here. I'm joined by Sean Chick, and tonight we're looking at Napoleon's opponents. This is not a comprehensive list of every general who fought against the First French Empire, but rather an examination of 21 commanders who faced off against Napoleon as the opposing commander in a major battle or campaign. These men hailed from Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain, and they are a pretty mixed lot, but overall I think it has to be said that Napoleon did face some fairly experienced and rather impressive men, and mostly got the better of them. We'll start out with someone who was a fellow monarch, Tsar Alexander I of Russia. What can you tell us about Tsar Alexander, Sean?
Alexander is interesting. He is the son of Tsar Paul I. He was a favorite of Catherine II, Catherine the Great. That was his grandmother. But of course, Tsar Paul was murdered. Now, Paul was murdered for favoring some liberal reforms, for having a pro-French foreign policy, and because he tried to bring the nobles to heed. I consider Paul a figure who probably really wasn't that bad, but in Russia, don't piss off a whole bunch of nobles, essentially, right? So anyway, Alexander himself was seen as kind of a liberal reformer. He's kind of like the sort of person who would read Rousseau and would talk about it in a very, he was very interested in it, but when it came to actual policy time, it didn't make much of a move. And of course, why would he? His father had been murdered for doing much more than what he was thinking of doing, you know? So anyway, Alexander I really didn't like Napoleon. He was upset over the murder of Louis, the Duke of, I can never pronounce it, like Annihilated or something. So he supported the war party in Austria, and essentially he's one of the main movers and shakers in creating the Third Coalition against France. Now, we don't think of Alexander often as a military commander. He's mostly ruler of Russia, but he did command at a battle, that being Austerlitz. What's interesting about this is that Napoleon read his opponent well. Now, the Austerlitz is fascinating because the battle's fought in late fall. Napoleon's supply situation is terrible. He needs, however, to fight the Austrian-Russian army before the Prussians can enter the war. What he did was he sent one of his emissaries to meet with Alexander. I believe it was Savary, who was one of Napoleon's intelligence officers. Anyway, he was essentially trying to ask for terms, and Napoleon figured that Alexander would see this as weakness, and Alexander's court was like, hey, Napoleon's weak, we can smash him. And so he's the guy who makes Austerlitz happen. Now, once the battle is actually being fought, he doesn't control the battle, but he is the one who made it happen and was there on the Austerlitz has a big effect on Alexander's psyche. After the battle, he concludes that he's no soldier, so he'll never again lead troops in a battle. He'll be present on a battlefield, but never again will he be forcing the issue like he did there and deciding anything with military plans. But also, it was his liberal circle of friends who had goaded him into battle, so whatever liberalizing instincts Alexander had also died at Austerlitz. In 1808, he made a deal with Napoleon. They became allied for a time. Napoleon really tried to win him over. In 1809, that alliance was tested. That's when Austria declared war on Napoleon again, and he had turned to fight them. That culminated in the Battle of Wagram. Russia did almost nothing during that battle, during that campaign. And even after that, Napoleon still gave the Russians some Austrian territory to try to win them over. But instead, Russia repaid him by ignoring the continental system, massing troops on the border, and actually Russia would have invaded the Napoleonic Empire in 1811. Army wasn't prepared, and the generals were bickering. That's an important thing to keep in mind. The Russian generals of this era are probably the biggest group of children you'll ever run into. All hate each other. They'll have factions, and so much of being a Russian commander was juggling different factions in the army. I believe Napoleon said that he believed the Russian soldiers were the finest of the era and their generals were the worst. And I kind of believe I in many ways agree with Napoleon. Now I know people might be like, oh, but Napoleon invaded Russia and failed. Well, that had more to do with the logistics of the situation and Napoleon's mistakes. I assure you, if the Russian generals had been smarter and more aggressive, Napoleon would have never made it out of Russia. Anyway, Napoleon did try to marry Alexander's sister, Anna. It was considered very beautiful. He stopped that from happening. The invasion of Russia occurs. Alexander did consider peace with Napoleon after Borodino, but he held on. After that, there was an argument in the Russian court about whether or not to pursue Napoleon. Kutuzov did not want to. Kutuzov actually wanted to have peace with Napoleon. But Alexander pressed it, and Alexander, in many ways, is one of the big forces for bringing down Napoleon. He's one of the men who's most steadfast. Following the fall of Napoleon, he became one of the arch conservatives of Europe. He also became very religious and suspicious in his old age. His death, by the way, led to the famous Decembrist Revolt, which also gave us the name of a mediocre folk band, you know? No, I'm kidding. The Decembrists are fine. They're just not great. They're fine. They're fine.
Yeah. Also, he has a really cool brother named Constantine.
He does. He does. We'll talk about him in a sec, man. I do want to conclude with Alexander that he was eccentric. What's really interesting about him is that opinions on him varied a lot. And a conclusion I've come to with Alexander, I've actually had two different Russian historians tell me that they think I'm dead on, is that Alexander had no central personality. He conformed himself to the way things were at the moment to impress or make people happy, whether that be a court, whether he's meeting Napoleon face-to-face or meeting his own nobles face-to-face. As such, people usually came away from Alexander thinking that he agreed with them and was their friend when he wasn't. So, an interesting czar. One could make a case that his overall failure to institute even anything but the mildest reforms, he sets up the Russian monarchy for its eventual collapse. Because one might make the argument that had they tried something earlier, maybe they could have had things off. But as it was, whatever reforms they had to do were held off. That meant that throughout next 100 years, the Russian monarchy is beset with alts and eventually revolution as well. So, yeah, but he had a badass brother named Constantine, right? Right, Derek?
Yeah, Constantine literally looks exactly like Karl Rove, the modern political strategist. And apparently Constantine undermined his brother at pretty much every opportunity. Was the heir apparent when Alexander died in 1825, but instead let it go to a younger brother, Nicholas, and then turned around and also undermined Nicholas as well, even after pledging his support. And apparently Constantine was, like, borderline treasonous at times, very hard to get along with, and pretty much pro-French from what I understand, too.
Yeah, I could see that. He's also, people always commented that he was hideous, you know?
Yeah, like I said, looks like Karl Rove.
Yeah, he looks like Karl Rove, only uglier. And not that Karl Rove is some handsome man, right? But I mean, like, think of Karl Rove with a more misshapen head.
Also, Karl Rove with more exposure to the sun.
Yeah, oh god. I mean, Constantine is... it's funny, every war game I've ever played, when he shows up, he's always like the worst Russian general, because they always gave him the guard. It was such a stupid idea.
Yeah, so did Alexander actually trust him, or... I don't really understand their relationship. Maybe he just wanted them nearby, and he figured that if you're the guard commander, your job is very basic.
I think he knew in the end that Constantine wasn't to be fully trusted, right? But he's got to give his brother some kind of position. And I probably figured his brother wasn't going to lead a rebellion against him,
Yeah. I guess, too, leading the guard's pretty hazardous. Do you think Alexander was low-key hoping that Constantine would catch a musket ball at some point?
I mean, he wouldn't have been that upset, I sometimes think, I'm not sure if it's the case, but I sometimes think Alexander's like a well-adjusted sociopath. I mean, he's just a liar. Can't be trusted for anything.
Although when you're talking about how he agrees with everyone to their face, FDR did that, and also Justinian the First. Both of them had that characteristic as well, a leadership style, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, but the thing is, I would say with Franklin Roosevelt, what I've read though, is that Franklin Roosevelt did have like some core beliefs. It's kind of hard to peg Alexander with any core beliefs. His beliefs also changed a lot. I mean, he went from being a kind of liberal admirer of Rousseau to being like a hardcore religious conservative in his old age. So maybe I'm being unfair to him in that regard, but I can't speak to Justinian the First. I know. I mean, I read The Secret History. According to that, he can detach his head. You know.
Yeah, I mean, which is a far cooler power than being able to dissemble to people.
Yeah. I know. I think Franklin Roosevelt just used that as a tactic, and also Franklin Roosevelt, I think he genuinely wanted people around him to be getting along and having a good time.
Yeah, because I feel like the thing I'm referencing is he had the one progressive Republican, I think Ikes or Ikas, or however you say his name. Then he had another major advisor who was more of a progressive Democrat, and even though they were kind of on this, you know, they sort of had the same vision for the country, but they still hated each other personally. And they would each have long conversations with Roosevelt about how the other one was an asshole. And then Roosevelt would be like, you're totally right. He is trying to undermine you. I'm sorry he's being like that, but we all got to get along. So he would accept both of their versions of events about how the other guy is 100% responsible for the feud. So, I mean, it was just a personnel management thing. And, I mean, it wasn't really substantive. But still, that sort of technique, I guess, can be pretty effective if you're trying to juggle conflicting personalities. And, you know, with Alexander, he's meeting foreign dignitaries and his own nobles, and they have egos the size of Texas, so maybe it's actually pretty smart on his part to be so accommodating to their faces.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, like I said, the Russian political thing is a snake pit. You know, the court is a snake pit.
I guess I should have said egos the size of Siberia, but you know, same idea.
Yeah. It does make some sense. I mean, and of course, I mean, look what happened to his father. You know.
True.
By the way, the degree to which he's involved in that thing, I don't think he was involved in the assassination attempt, but he certainly didn't do much to punish a lot of people involved. You know.
So that's part of why you think he's sociopathic.
Yeah, I think he's like if he's not sociopathic, he's like getting there. You know, like if you have like a list of like, I think it's 10 or 12 things, you need like 7 of them to be sociopath. He's probably at 5 or 6.
Okay, interesting.
He's not. He's borderline.
All right. So I guess, are we ranking him based on his decision to fight at Austerlitz mostly, or on his overall performance as the commander-in-chief of the Russian forces?
He didn't really dictate. I mean, he might dictate some grand strategy stuff, like, you know, we'll press Napoleon, we'll go into France. I'm only really going to I only include him on this list because of how involved he was in the Austerlitz campaign, and I'd give him an F.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean, he did fuck that up pretty bad. Well, to the extent that he did much beyond ordering the battle.
I mean, he ordered the battle, and he did give some general orders during the battle, but it's mostly what he does before the battle. He is very involved. He's involved enough in the operations and the decision to go to battle to say that I say at Austerlitz he is the commander.
Meanwhile, his brother, the handsome and heroic Konstantin Pavlovich, was leading the guard and fighting bravely for his country on the field.
Indeed.
All right. Next up, we have Joseph Alvinci.
Joseph Alvinci. Yeah, you ever read Hemingway's Farewell to Arms?
No.
Couldn't get into it, mostly because I forget it. But this is going to connect, okay? But you know the book's about, right?
It's about the Spanish Civil War. Or?
No, that's I guess The Sun Also Rises. I want to say.
Didn't he also write Homage to Catalonia, or was that George Orwell?
That's George Orwell. No, For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's the Spanish Civil War.
Okay, I think I'm pretty sure I read one of those two books. I can't remember which one for some reason.
Well, the thing is, I liked the first half of A Farewell to Arms, but once he gets wounded and he's in the hospital, the nurse character didn't seem real to me. She just seemed like, hi, I'm an attractive woman who likes this guy, you know, very shallow, right? But
Right.
the reason I mention is that Hemingway has one of the greatest lines about the Napoleonic Wars ever in that book, because, you know, it's the Italians find the Austrians, and he says the Austrians exist to give Napoleon victories. And he said not just Napoleon the First. He then says Napoleon the Third as well, which is true. Napoleon the Third, his greatest military triumphs against the Austrians. So Alvensi is one of these hapless Austrian generals who's going to be beat up by Napoleon. That said, he was one of the he had done very well in the 7 Years' War and the War of the Bavarian Succession. Which is a really weird war if you want to read about that one. There was no battles fought, but there were skirmishes. He tutored the young Francis II, fought the Turks, and helped suppress a rebellion in Belgium. So before he meets Napoleon, he's easily one of the best of the Austrian generals, or considered one of the best. At Neerwinden, which is like one of the one of the French Republic's worst defeats, he led the attack that turned the tide. And he's in Vienna overseeing strategic planning when he's sent to Italy to save the situation. Now, he's able to organize and raise an army of 50,000 men, but most of them are raw. He does take Napoleon head on. He defeated Massena at Bassano, although Napoleon arrived at Bassano, which could be debated that he was defeated there, but I don't want to get into Bassano. It's actually a battle I don't know a ton about. I do know about the next battle that happened, which is Caladero. Napoleon attacked Alvensi and was defeated. This is considered usually Napoleon's first battlefield defeat. But Alvensi divided his forces. He was beat at Arcola, and then the next year he tried again, and that culminated in the Battle of Revalle, which is one of Napoleon's greatest victories. It happened in early 1797. So Alvensi was not a terrible commander, really. He's probably better as a subordinate. When he was on his own, he could go from being aggressive to timid. He definitely had a tendency to disperse his forces. He actually spent the rest of the war leading the garrison in Hungary. So that's how he ends the rest of his time.
Yeah, apparently also he was very personally brave, even was a young officer in the 7 Years' War, and then even in Italy, or not necessarily Italy, but some of the other campaigns he was at. I think I read in 1793 at Charleroi, he was relieving a siege and he had 2 horses shot out from under him. And he's pretty old by this point. He had been almost 60 at that point.
Oh yeah, no, he's brave, and I sort of feel like he's not really a terrible general. He's up in his years, and he's a product of the 7 Years' War. And that was fine in the early part of the French Revolutionary Wars. By the time you get into the late 1790s, it just doesn't work anymore.
So, I also get the impression that his social rank wasn't super high. So he's not like a high-ranking noble or anything like that, is he?
No, I mean, not from what I know of him. He's from Transylvania. I'm reading about that. Which is kind of like the backwater of the empire. But, I mean, he had enough of a reputation to be a tutor to the king, or the emperor, you know?
Yeah, I imagine that was probably what propelled his career forward.
Yeah. Like Francis II's like, you're cool. You were my teacher, you know?
Yeah, you can become a Feldmarschall Lieutenant. Or Feldmarschall Lieutenant, I guess is their version of it. Their ranking system for the Austrian army is a little complicated. They have 3 different ranks that incorporate some version of Field Marshal into it, but they're apparently 3 different ranks.
Yeah, he was that's weird, man. Yeah, dude, the Austrian system's convoluted.
Yeah, apparently he was promoted to a rank called Feldzugmeister, which sounds pretty cool, even though I have no idea what it means, but apparently it's very high up.
I like being a Zugmeister.
Yeah, Feldzugmeister.
Feldzug.
I mean, it sounds like some title somebody would get for winning some sort of strange German dance contest.
What do you think of him? What would you rank him?
Um, Based on his performance against Napoleon, I would say like he's probably a C or a D. I mean, he's okay. Nothing special though.
I go with a D, and I think it has to do with Caladero. He does, and granted, that battle is interesting. Napoleon act into a snowstorm, essentially, so with the winds like blowing in his men's faces. But I mean, it's Napoleon's making a premature attack against an Austrian general who he may not be a genius, but he's definitely not a quitter. You know?
Yeah, and he's also been soldiering since he was 14. So I mean, it's not like he's new at this.
Yeah,
exactly. Just some fop from court who got appointed to command an army or anything like that.
Yeah, I think I'd go with a D.
Yeah, that seems fair. How about Ahmad Pasha? Wait, no, sorry, wrong one. Next up is actually Peter Bagration.
He's still a hero in Russia.
I bet he is.
They named a bridge after him like 20 years ago. One in Moscow. Not like a bridge in the middle of nowhere, like a bridge in Moscow they built, you know? He was one of Alexander Suvorov's favorite commanders. He was known for dashing, good humor. The men loved him because of his courage, and his nickname was the Eagle. Beloved by the Russian nobility as well. That being said, his wife cheated on him. He cheated on her. Okay, it's the era of open relationships, right? Racked up large debts, especially from gambling, and he's one of these guys that tend to drink a lot. Very much part of that, like, the type of noble that was popular in the Romantic age, you know, almost Byronic, if you will. You know, I mean, look at those killer sideburns, too, you know?
Yeah, I mean, those could work in almost any era. Well, except probably the present, but...
No, well, I mean, have you been to the hipster parts of town, man? I mean, they still work, right?
Yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, certain coffee shops, now that they're starting to reopen, are probably sporting a lot of facial hair right now.
Yeah. Now, Bagration led a corps, and he actually did well at Austerlitz, and he won a small battle before Austerlitz. But Miladrovich got more fame, and him and Miladrovich despised each other afterwards. They were both kind of competitors for who's the greatest corps commander in Russia. You know? He did well at Eylau and Heilsberg, but he didn't do so well at Friedland. But still, he's a hero, and was nicknamed the God of the Army. So when Napoleon invades, he is one of the guys put in charge of the main Russian armies to fight him. He wanted to battle Napoleon right away. So the other guy who's in charge, the overall commander, Barclay de Tolly, and we'll talk about him later, Barclay says, we got to retreat. We're outnumbered by Napoleon. We all know his army's better than ours. We'll do the whole scorched earth thing. Bagration was like, we're a coward. So these two men openly fighting, openly bickering with each other. Bagration will then suffer a mortal wound at Borodino. Interestingly enough, while dying at Borodino, he reconciled with Barclay. And the thing is that he, because of his heroics, if you will, because he had done so well, he becomes sort of this legend in the Russian army. And think about it, besides the fact that he was a good combat commander and very charismatic and popular, and even Napoleon had respect for him. I think Napoleon considered him the best of the Russian generals. He also died fighting Napoleon, one of the biggest and bloodiest battles of the era. So Bagration is a shoo-in to become like a popular hero, if you will. So much so that Joseph Stalin loved him so much that he named Operation Bagration after him. The summer 1944 offensive, which is often considered the Soviet Union's greatest victory of World War II. Oh, fun fact, the Nazis did blow up his grave during the war. Of course they did. Yeah. I mean, the Nazis they had a high regard for French and Italian art, but Russian art and Russian people are Slavs, so they're them and the Jews are the main two groups in the extermination list. I remember reading that in Russia they used Tchaikovsky's original symphonies to wipe grease off of their motorcycles. It's Slavic art.
That's disgraceful in the extreme.
Yeah. I mean, that's what extremists do. Extremists destroy art. It's what they do, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, Bagration, I think a lot of his reputation is just to do with the word bravery and because he was pretty good. But he wasn't some tactical genius, and he definitely had a hard time getting along with a variety of officers. He's tailor-made for the Romantic era, though. You know, he's charming, brash, lustful, and heroic, with a dash of fatalism. I don't know. I think I'll rate him a C just because I believe if Bagration had his way in 1812 and they duked it out with Napoleon on the border, I think the Russian army would have probably been annihilated, and Napoleon's Russian campaign would be remembered as a mark of genius.
Yeah, I guess it would have become kind of like a Liam Neeson action movie where all the bad guys just feed themselves to him like on a conveyor belt. And then he's able to use his limited repertoire of moves to kick their asses.
There's always that thing in those action movies when like they're surrounded, and instead of everybody mobbing him, it's like one or two guys at a time come up to them and get beat up.
And they all approach from the front, where this person can do their maximum damage. They never really test them by attacking from the side or behind, or like you said, or more than one or two at a time.
Yeah, I've always fucking hated that. I'll say this, man. At least your video games like Final Fight and Streets of Rage were more realistic about people ganging up on you.
Yeah, true. And also the 8-bit games, in a way, might be the most accurate, in the sense that normally you get the fucking shit kicked out of you unless you master the jump kick. So unless you have extraordinary athletic abilities, it is not very probable for one person to beat the shit out of, say, 6 or 8 people at once.
So you're telling me that Double Dragon and the Ninja Turtles beat 'em ups have it right, huh?
In a way. That being said, obviously doing jump attacks will wear your ass out really fast. So if those games are super accurate, it would be, one screen's worth of enemies. You clear them with all the jump kicks, and that's the game.
Also, you punch people so much in those games, right? You're just like, my God, this person has broken their fist over and over again,
Also, I feel, for whatever reason, I can't really enjoy the 8-bit beat-em-ups because it does rely so heavily on jump kicks. I just feel like it's more repetitive and boring than any other beat-em-up. And also, you have to be extraordinarily precise to the point where it's like doing surgery. It's just...
It is.
It takes the fun out of it.
Everybody I know is good at 8-bit games. They'll also be great at other physical precision things like playing music or something.
Yeah, and they must have some penchant for doing tedious stuff.
That said, a lot of respect for Double Dragon games, and there's that fun part in Double Dragon 2 where you're in a helicopter and you don't have to move because the bad guys will come out and then the door will open and they fall to their death.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of elevator stages like that in old school beat 'em ups.
Yeah, this one, you're in a helicopter, and you're in the helicopter, and the bad guys come out, and then the door opens, and it sucks them out. And as long as you don't fight them, they'll just keep killing themselves.
The skeleton warriors in Golden Axe do the same thing. As if they have a ledge to the bottom or top of them, all you have to do is walk in that direction, and they will match your movements on the other side of the screen and voluntarily walk themselves off the cliff.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, and that's the easiest way to deal with them, because the skeletons will fuck your shit. I mean, a lot of the other enemies aren't that bad, but the skeletons in Golden Axe are a nightmare. All right.
So who's our next gentleman?
Levin von Bennigsen.
Oh, Bennigsen. Bennigsen's another example of why the Russian army can't get shit done. But anyway, he comes from a Hanoverian military family. Bennigsen hated Tsar Paul I because he had demoted him, so he's actually one who helped plan his murder. Bennigsen was not punished directly, except that he was out of favor at court. The idea of Alexander wasn't going to punish a guy like that directly, but he also was like, hey, I don't want you hanging out with me because now it looks like I'm okay with you murdering my dad, But after the defeat at Austerlitz, Alexander I turns to him in desperation. Bennigsen wasn't at first the overall commander. It was a guy named Kaminsky, but Bennigsen attacked at Polotsk. He was defeated, but he did well enough, or Alexander was impressed with his aggression enough to make him the new commander. Bennigsen was very good as maneuvers. Napoleon actually called him one of the better maneuverers he faced in any of the opponents. And he fought at Eylau, and he nearly beat Napoleon. And understand, Eylau is a French victory, but it's a very bloody one, and the monarchs of Europe were very excited after Eylau, thinking, oh, this guy Benningsig, I mean, he did well against Napoleon. The next battle could be a victory. Nope, he gets smashed at Friedland. He did win a small victory at Heilsberg. But anyway, yeah, Friedland's pretty bad. Even the vaunted Russian guards were fled the field afterwards.
Was Constantine in command at the time?
I believe so.
Oh, wow. I didn't think Constantine could be broken. That's quite a feat.
Yeah. Benningsig was made Kutuzov's chief of staff, but by that time the Russian officers despised him, and he was forced out of command. In 1813, he led the Russian reserves. He did play a role at Leipzig, where he did well. Benningsig was a very aggressive man, and Napoleon, once again, really admired his operational maneuvers. But tactically, he was not that great, and honestly, he was so bad at handling other officers, and he would blame them for his defeats and mishaps. He was an intriguer, just a deeply flawed commander. I mean, a deeply flawed person, and a flawed commander as well. I don't know. There's some historians lately who have been trying to say, "Oh, Benningsig's better than we thought." I think they're overstating it. I give him a D.
All right. So far, the Russian chain of command is not inspiring a lot of confidence.
No, it's a fucking nightmare.
All right. Well, I think we're about to have a big pickup in quality, because next up is Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher.
Yeah, you know much about Blücher?
I know that he basically won the Battle of Waterloo, and I know that he was Prussia's best general. Pretty much, wasn't he really their only good general during this whole period?
No, they have a variety of good corps commanders. He's really the only one who arises as a good, like, army general, if you will.
I know he was also pregnant with an elephant, so that's interesting.
Pregnant with an elephant?
Didn't he go up to Wellington after Waterloo and say that he felt like he was pregnant with an elephant?
I don't know about that, but that makes sense.
Yeah, so apparently he had a sort of penchant for saying odd things. I know he's a hard fighter and, you know, pretty solid commander from what I understand.
Oh yeah, hard drinker, known for being a gambler. He actually started off in the Swedish service. Defected to Prussia after he was captured. He was fiery and impulsive, also known for chasing women. And actually, he was despised by Frederick the Great, apparently. Who,
oh, wow.
Yeah, apparently, like, helped kick him out of the Prussian army eventually. He was just tired of his bullshit, I guess, you know? But he did help suppress the Dutch Revolution, or Dutch Revolt, because it failed, of 1787. Blücher was attached to the cavalry. Now, he's a vocal supporter of fighting against the French. In fact, over the years, he became a confirmed Francophobe. When I say Francophobe, his Prussian forces were definitely the ones committing the most atrocities in France in 1814. He used to give his men orders like he used to give take no prisoners type orders, you know?
Oh, so he's sort of like borderline psycho.
A bit. He did piss poor at Osterdat. He ordered a bunch of stupid charges. He escaped, but his cavalry was then smashed by Marat, Lubeck, and was just utterly humiliated. What happens is that Blücher is not very smart, but he knows smart people when he sees them. Even though he was, by the way, he was banished from the Prussian court because he kept openly calling for war. So the French were like, "Hey, we need you to make sure this hothead is out of favor." But that said, he was supporting a variety of military reformers and reforms in the Prussian army. So in 1813, he becomes the new head of the Prussian command. He is defeated by Napoleon at Bautzen, but he manages to beat McDonald at the Katzbach, which is one of the worst defeats the French army suffered during the era. One thing I can say for Blücher is that whenever the Allies would start to waver during the campaign, he was the one who would say, "We must press on." And at Leipzig, he fought superbly. And I would say if there's any commander who's responsible for the victory at Leipzig, if you're going to give it to one guy, give it to Blücher. He's the one who makes sure they go there and that they fight it out to the very end. However, his forces were smashed by Napoleon during the 6 Days Campaign in 1814. Of course, during the Waterloo Campaign, he was defeated at Ligny, but he marched hard to Wellington's aid, and his flank attack made battle, which could have gone either way, into a decisive French defeat. Yeah, so he dies a national hero. Blucher is not a great general. Kind of dumb. He'd lose control of himself in battle. He wasn't very good at grand maneuvers, so he could be overly aggressive. His understanding of terrain was known as particularly poor. One could make the case that he was the kind of guy who would direct the army where to go and rally the troops, while the staff would handle the details. It is to his credit, though, that he understood his own limitations in many cases. Apparently there's an expression in German called "attack it like Blucher" or something, which I've been told is still used sometimes today.
So does that mean delegate all of the details to other people and do like the business CEO approach and go play golf? I mean, he's very active. He's on the front lines, getting shot at. He is very aggressive. Even after defeat like the 6 Days, he just says, "Okay, whatever. We still have more men than Napoleon. Keep pressing on." I find it hard to rate Blucher, but he could be incredibly stupid. But at the same time, he understood that if he's going to be successful, he has to press on. He has to rally the men, and he is good at picking capable subordinates. So what was his performance like at the Battle of Ligny? Because I know he lost and he was pursued by Grouchy, but how did he actually perform during that battle?
I would say badly. It was actually kind of one of those battles where he really didn't know what was going on. Staff knows better what's going on.
I mean, are we talking about him not knowing what's going on the level of, say, Mark Antony in the HBO Rome series where Augustus asks him what's going on and he says, "I have absolutely no idea. Let's attack."
Yeah. Maybe not that bad. There's an expression T. Harry Williams used to describe General Joseph Hooker. He said that a guy like Joseph Hooker at the Battle of Chancellorsville, one of the problems is he couldn't make what's called war on a map. That for him, war was very much an immediate thing. What's going on in my immediate sight is what he could control. Now, I think Williams is being very unfair to Hooker. I think Hooker could make war on a map, but I'm not sure if Blucher could. You know? That being said, post-Ligny, he's good at rallying the troops and making sure that they do go to Wellington's aid. And keep in mind, there were members of his staff who were like, "Look, we can't trust the Brits. Nobody can really trust them. Let's just leave them and their allies to their fate. Let's preserve the Prussian army." You know, but he was like, no, we must go to where the fighting is.
So I guess he must have had a good deal of charisma and ability to inspire men, though.
Tons of it. And I mean, you know, like he wasn't good at the technical aspects of war, but he did understand march hard, fight hard, front the enemy.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he is kind of hard to rate because while he had some things that should have prevented him from being successful, he did at least have awareness of those shortcomings and tried to make up for them by putting people around him.
I'm going with a B, although I almost want to give him a C.
All right, B sounds fair. I mean, I was actually thinking C, but B sounds good too. All right, next up we have Charles William Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick.
Yeah, this is one of these guys on the list I feel kind of bad for, you know? Came from a prominent German family. His uncle was the Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, who was one of Frederick the Great's generals who won a variety of battles in the 7 Years' War, considered one of the best commanders of that era. Brunswick's very much one of those enlightened despot types, if you will. So, of course, he was very well learned. He enacted a variety of liberal reforms. He was a supporter of the arts. Frederick the Great was a big fan of his, so he kind of said that, hey, when I die, this man should lead the Prussian army. That said, he led the Prussian army that invaded France in 1792, and he issued the overly harsh Brunswick Manifesto, which helped rally the people to the new French Republic. And he was the man who turned back at Valmy, who fell back. Now, Valmy's not really a battle. Really, Valmy is essentially two armies line up, they skirmish, and they almost have a big battle, but it doesn't happen. You know? That said, he just resigned from command the next year. Apparently over discussed with both Frederick William II, King of Prussia, and his own disputes with the Austrians. The Austrians were very poor at coordination. It should be noted that after 1792, the Prussians really weren't that involved in the French Revolutionary Wars. Anyway, he supported war with Napoleon in 1806 and was given command of the main army. Its organization was very poor, and they represented the need to placate factions rather than sound organization. Although it would have been smarter to wait for the Russians to arrive, Brunswick was contemptuous of the French. He believed that, hey, this is the Prussian army, the finest in Europe. Napoleon ain't seen nothing yet. And to be fair, Napoleon himself was very wary of fighting the Prussians. Although he fought an aggressive campaign, he would confide to everybody. He was like, hey, I've never fought Prussia. And as far as he was concerned, Frederick the Great was the greatest commander of all time, except maybe Alexander. So Napoleon's mind, he's like, I'm about ready to fight what I think is the best army around. And as you know, that ends with Brunswick's army being smashed. Brunswick didn't actually confront Napoleon. He fought Davout at Osterdat, where he was mortally wounded. His death in particular, he was shot. I'm sorry, not mortally wounded. He was mortally. He was shot in the head and became blind. Once he is taken out, the army loses control, and that's one of the leading reasons why Osterdat is such an embarrassing Russian defeat.
Yeah, didn't he have Davout outnumbered 2 or 3 to 1?
I'd say about 3 to 2, roughly, maybe 2 to 1.
Oh.
Maybe actually closer to 2 to 1. By the way, the Prussian army, because they want to make him into a hero, said that actually he died leading a charge instead of like getting shot in the head during a scouting mission. That said, I mean, before these wars, he was a pioneer in light infantry tactics. I think he was one of these guys who was just used to the 7 Years' War way of fighting. He hadn't really upgraded himself. And he was also hamstrung by having to placate so many factions. And he most certainly overrated how good the Prussian army was. If you think about it, too, I mean, the Prussian army wasn't... There's a portrayal of the Prussian army at Jena Osterdat that it was a fossil of the 7 Years' War. And there's some truth in that. Prussians, oddly enough, had very good light infantry, but poor skirmisher tactics, if you get my drift.
Yeah, that is kind of odd.
Yeah, so like the Prussians had like good independent light infantry units that could go out and fight the enemy, but they really weren't good at developing a skirmish line. And while the Prussian army wasn't exactly an antique, it had not made some of the reforms that the other militaries, particularly who by that time, the Austrians, for instance, are making major reforms at this time in their military. The Prussians just hadn't. So you have a guy fighting an army that's slightly outdated and also relatively inexperienced. I mean, certainly his officers were veterans. A lot of his men had not been in battle before, and they're fighting a French army of veterans. I mean, that's very foolish of Brunswick. I don't know. I feel bad for the guy, but I got to go with an E.
Sounds about right. All right.
Well, maybe even an F. I don't know.
I feel like he's still better than Alexander at Austerlitz, though.
I guess. I mean, his handle of the Jena campaign is really poor. I gotta go with an F, actually.
All right. Well, that's. I guess Alexander is not lonely anymore.
No, that Brunswick screwed up bad.
All right. Well, next up, we have Archduke Charles, Duke of Teshon, who is, as I understand, one of your personal favorite generals.
That would not entirely be true. It's one of Danny's favorites.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, I do like Archduke Charles. I think he's an interesting man. He doesn't really fit the era too well. He's extremely reserved. He despised the court life. He liked being in the army, and he fought throughout a variety of those French Revolutionary War battles, like near Winden, Jemappes. And in 1796, he was given command of the Austrian army. He's only 25 years old, but of course he's the brother of Francis II, so this is about as high-ranking a noble as you can be, right?
Yeah.
Royalty. And I mean, he'd already done very well. Anyway, he exceeds expectations. He takes on Jourdan and Moreau and defeats both of them in a series of campaigns. That said, the campaign is nullified because Napoleon conquers Italy. Anyway, you get to the 1805 campaign. Charles had been opposing war with France. He was part of the peace faction. Now, peace faction doesn't mean let's be friends with Napoleon forever. It just means, hey, we need time to get this army ready if we're going to fight this man. But the war faction wins out, and as such, Charles is not at Austerlitz. In fact, he was sent to Italy. Now, didn't do very well in Italy, actually. It's probably his worst camp. But with Austerlitz over, Charles is looked to as the military savior of Austria. So he instituted a series of reforms that allow the Austrian army to be bigger, such as in the Landwehr. Some of the bad officers were weeded out, and he introduces a corps structure. That said, one problem he runs into is he can't force out every mediocre officer. So the Austrian system, while their organization is better, when the 1809 campaign starts, Charles says still forced into it. He feels like they're still not ready. But also it's a new system of war, so it's better than the old one, but they're still learning the ropes.
Right.
Now, Charles at first he's able to invade Bavaria, which goes well at first till Napoleon arrives and pulls off what's known as the Landshut maneuver. Beats Napoleon Aspern-Essling. This is Napoleon's first major defeat since the Egyptian campaign. However, nothing goes right anywhere else. The Austrian armies in Italy, Dalmatia, Hungary, and Poland are all defeated. And he then confronts Napoleon at Wagram. He comes close to winning, but ultimately it is a defeat. They have to concede. With that, Charles is essentially out of favor for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. His only role really is in 1815. He did organize the reserves. He helped organize the men being sent to the front for the 1815 campaign, but otherwise just not involved anymore. It seems that his legend grew more as the years went on, and the Austrian military continued to lose a lot.
Yeah.
With a few notable exceptions. You have Radetzky in Italy in 1848. He did really well.
He was still active in 1848?
Yeah, old, tough old man. Oh man, Radetzky is hilarious. Radetzky, of all these conservative noble types of this era, Radetzky's my favorite. And, one of my favorite things he did was when he was in Italy, he found out that the government there was trying to ban smoking, so he had his men just smoke and puff smoke in front of the politicians' faces. I'm just like, oh my god, this guy's a troll. It's amazing. Yeah, I don't know. Charles is a very good maneuverer, good at organizing men. He was ultimately hamstrung more by the politicians, really, which I know now I sound like I'm some Vietnam War crank, but it's true. The political forces in Austria hampered what Charles was trying to do. I think if he had any one defect, it might be that in battle he didn't quite have a killer instinct. At the same time, his tactical dispositions were very good. I'd give him an A, personally. What do you think?
He sounds like a pretty good general. I mean, I've never read anything bad about him. I know, you and Danny are fans, and he won Aspern-Essling, which was a pretty impressive victory. And, of course, he's a reformer, which is always good if you're trying to counteract Napoleon's army. I did read one critique of him by Clausewitz, and I wanted to get your take on it. Clausewitz said that Archduke Charles tended to be rigid and that he adhered to a, quote, geographic strategy. I was wondering, one, what is a geographic strategy? And two, is there any validity to that critique?
The rigidity, I can see that. He wasn't a fast thinker, if you like, battlefield. That being said, I don't know of too many people who really had that going on in spades to begin with. I mean, certainly not Bennigsen, right? Geographic idea is the debate between geographic points versus destroying an enemy.
Ah.
Now, I think I would contend it's in some ways a false debate. If you go after a strategic point, usually your enemy's going to fight over it. You know what I mean? So it could be said that maybe Charles went after a strategic point but wasn't willing to fight over it, but I don't really see that necessarily. I guess the case could be made that Charles maybe overemphasized those points, the exclusion of just going after the enemy's army. But I believe in this era and ever after, there's been a fetishization of destroy the enemy's army, you know, make that your objective. And I'm like, if you make a strategic point the objective, you'll get a battle. If the enemy just gives you up a strategic point to you, that's a victory. Now, the problem is when you have an army that treats the capture of a strategic point as being a decisive victory or a complete victory when it's not, right? So, for instance, when the German army is marching on Paris or marching towards Paris in 1914, the Germans were their army was running into problems logistically, but morale was very high, and the German generals started to think, hey, fought the Battle of the Frontiers, we beat the French, we're chasing them down, we've got this. But it's like, no, you know, you haven't quite come to grips with them yet. I know the French are giving up valuable real estate, but that means their army is still dangerous. You know? So I think if somebody emphasized strategic points to the exclusion of the enemy's army, they could fall prey to that. Maybe it could be debated that Charles did, but I just don't particularly see it. I think it more has to do tactically that he didn't have quite as killer of an instinct, and more importantly, he's hamstrung by the government that he serves. I mean, essentially, this guy has to fight 2 wars that he tells them beforehand, you know, you shouldn't be fighting this, right? We're not ready. And must be noted in 1809, when that was said and done, Napoleon was very impressed with the Austrians. And it should be noted that before 1809, Napoleon typically scoffed at Charles, but after that, he said, no, Charles is good. And towards the end of his life, he said, Charles was the best opponent I had.
Huh.
Now, some of that gets into my discussion of Wellington because, you know, great generals tend to integrate each other. You know what I mean? Because when you're a great general, it doesn't create a lot of humility. You know what I'm saying?
I guess that's fair. So, yeah, so A tier for Charles?
I would say so. I understand what Clausewitz is getting at, but I would say that that is indicative of the weakness of the German way of war, which emphasized destroy the enemy's army. You know, maybe overemphasized it, if you will.
Ah.
And of course, the Germans would do that. They have to win quickly, given their geographic position. You know?
Right. All right, next up we have Frederick Louis, Prince of Hohenlohe-Ingelfingen.
Ingelfingen?
Yeah, it's Hohenlohe-Ingelfingen.
What is this, like Finkel and Einhorn?
I don't know. Some German place, I suppose.
I'm mentioning Ace Ventura. You know, it should not be mentioned in polite company, right?
Oh, I didn't. But I haven't seen that movie since I was a kid, so.
Well, now it's a transphobic movie, so just remember that, all right?
Oh, it is? Yeah, I have no idea. I hadn't heard that.
Ain't no way they can make Ace Ventura 2 nowadays, even though it's hilarious. But anyway, so Hohenlohe, like a lot of these guys, fought in the 7 Years' War. Led a corps in the French Revolutionary Wars. Didn't do that great, really. But he was popular with the Prussian army, brave, considered a solid tactician. And he's essentially the de facto commander of the Prussian army after 1794. Now, Hohenlohe joined Brunswick and Queen Louise in the call for war with France. Brunswick set to lead the army. Hohenlohe felt that it was supposed to be his army, so they openly bicker. You can already see why Jena-Austerdat's going to go the way that it does. Well, at the Battle of Jena, his men failed to hold the bridges, and then his troops were pounded by the by the French artillery and then smashed to pieces. One of his big problems is he maintained tightly packed lines, so the French artillery was particularly effective at Jena. That said, when the battles are over, Hohenlohe is the guy who tries to keep the fight up. He's like, hey, we got to keep this going. But By that point, it's too late, and he was actually bluffed into surrendering the remnants of the army. Hohenlohe afterwards returns to Prussia. He was popular with some of the reformers. Blücher liked him, for instance, and they tried to actually get him to rejoin the Prussian army for the 1813 campaigns, but he turned him down. Don't know a ton about him. He could be wavering at times, overly aggressive and then overly timid. His staff was considered to be very poor, and he didn't have a great nose for talent. And I kind of feel like maybe Blücher liked him a lot, and I think Blücher saw how bad his staff was and was one of the reasons Blücher said, you know what? I'm like Hohenlohe. I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but I need to get the smartest guys like Scharnhorst and Neinhausen and the rest of them. So yeah, I think Hohenlohe's not really the greatest. One of the reasons I gave Brunswick an F, by the way, is because he failed at Valmy and Brunswick and the Manifesto. So I rated him based on some army actions that he took before fighting Napoleon. Right. And I got to kind of give Hohenlohe an F.
It's been a dark outing for Prussia, I guess.
Prussia, the 1806 campaign is considered a pivotal moment in Russian and even German history. Their beloved army that they considered the scourge of Europe was destroyed, routed.
Wasn't it also a pretty risky campaign because it was initiated in the winter, and so it was pretty unusual?
No, it was a summer campaign. Prussian society was transformed after that. It became something more along the lines of what you would start to see by the mid-1800s. Prussia instituted a series of reforms, if you will. Some liberalization, but mostly military reforms. And for that reason, the 1806 campaign was heavily studied by the Germans and always loomed like a shadow over them. Think about it. They went into a war, and they essentially got out-Prussianed, if you will, right?
Right.
Yeah, I remember when I first read, because I'd read about Frederick the Great when I was in high school. I didn't read about Napoleon. So when I finally read about Jena, maybe 10, 12 years later, I was in shock. I was like, oh my God, this great Prussian army didn't just get beat, they got annihilated. I believe Jena Austerstadt is the finest Napoleonic. But so the shock to their system and their psyche. I mean, it's almost kind of like when the Russians, I mean, not when the Romans would recount like Cannae and Trabia stuff, right?
Yeah.
Hannibal came over the Alps and destroyed 3 Roman armies. If I'm not mistaken, didn't he win some smaller, but still very smaller but still like tactically decisive battles after Cannae? He won a few too, right?
There were some victories for sure. Nothing on that scale again, and nothing which really changed the tide and changed Rome from gaining momentum. But yeah, he won some battles here and there. He also got Capua to defect in 215, which was about a full year after the Battle of Cannae.
I mention that just because those small battles, I know they didn't change the strategic outlook, but I remembered reading about those some years back, and he still won like decisive tactical victories. Like the Roman armies he confronted were destroyed.
I don't know if he destroyed any more armies. I mean, he might have routed them from the field, but I don't think he had the resources to actually finish them off. So, I mean, it was embarrassing and it was damaging, but it was damaging in a temporary sense rather than, wiping out an entire standing army.
I think the ones I'm talking about, and I can't remember their names right now, I'm sorry, but they were like Trabia scale, if you will.
Yes, I mean, those would not have necessarily changed much, because also you got to remember that Roman generals were looking for opportunities to fight Hannibal's allies and subordinates. So Hannibal, at least his subordinates are losing battles at the same time, and that original core of his men is constantly being reduced. So even if he wins a few battles here and there, it's not necessarily helping him all that much in the grand scheme of things.
I don't know. I'm stuck. A victory is a victory, and you want to get them.
I mean, victories are great, but if your subordinates and your allies aren't pulling their weight, then those victories won't really get you very far in the long run.
Yeah, but I mean, it's allowing you to stay in Italy. I mean, it's keeping your war effort alive. I mean, Hannibal's hanging out in Italy long after Cannae. My point is that Hannibal wins those 3 famous victories and some ones later on, which prove that, hey, he's tactically the finest commander of those wars, right?
I would say so.
So Hannibal is the shadow over Rome, right? For the Romans, this could happen to us again. And Napoleon is the shadow over Prussia. This could happen to us again. But you better damn well make sure the Prussian army is the very finest in Europe, because if you don't, Germany, Prussia will be overrun. Napoleon proved it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the defeat of Jena-Austerlitz is decisive in, certainly decisive in German military, and I would say social history as well. Plus, Jena itself had a university where Hegel taught, and a variety of the German Romantic philosophers, the authors, were hanging out in the area. Hegel's famous line about Napoleon is that when he saw him ride by, he said, "I saw world history on horseback."
Wow. Yeah, I guess he also invented that term world historical figure, too.
Yeah, I believe Hegel considered Jena one of the most important events in human history. Which, I mean, he's so Prussian focused, of course he'd think that,
Of course.
But the psychological cultural influence of that disaster for Germany cannot be overstated.
Well, yeah, I guess the proud military tradition of Frederick the Great was completely and totally destroyed by one of his admirers.
Yeah. Yeah, and fun fact, when Napoleon goes to Berlin, he actually goes to Frederick the Great's grave and has a moment of silence with his head bowed. And then he apparently tells his fellow officers if he was in command, we wouldn't be here right now.
I guess, too, Frederick had only been dead for about 20 years by that point, right?
God, I think less than that, actually.
Didn't he die of, 1786 or so?
Oh, maybe it was like 92-ish. But maybe it is 86. Yeah, no, 86 makes sense, yeah. He's only been dead about 20 years, yeah.
So that's interesting. But I guess, if he had still been alive, he'd have been too old to actually command, so probably would not have helped much.
Well, I guess what he means is if,
yeah, still alive and able-bodied, but...
Yeah, like there's a Prussian time machine that plucks Frederick the Great out and says, here, you gotta go fight Napoleon now,
Yeah, all right, it's 20 years after your death, but things have changed some, but figure it out.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but we need you to beat a military genius, not like Charles of Lorraine.
Because we tried it with the generals of our own time, and things went really shittily, so we're hoping that maybe you can get a slightly better result. Good luck.
Yeah.
All right. Next up, we go back to Russia, and we have Mikhail Kutuzov.
Yeah, Kutuzov is one of the more notable commanders of the era. He was a favorite of Alexander Suvorov, and he was actually a favorite of Tsar Paul I. So after he gets murdered, him and Alexander I do not like each other, and they will carry on that enmity for the rest of time. But because he was seen as Suvorov's protege, he was made the principal army commander in 1805. The only problem is Alexander's over his shoulder telling him what to do. Interestingly enough, he said, don't fight at Austerlitz. He could see the trap for what it was, but here's where it gets bad. Alexander says, we're going to fight there anyway. So while they're planning the operation, Kutuzov falls asleep. And he handled the battle very poorly. So when it's over, even though Alexander privately acknowledges that he's no Alexander the Great, he shouldn't be in command, he did decide to blame it on Kutuzov. So Kutuzov was sent to the Turkish front, and that's where he was until 1812. Now, Kutuzov pulls off one of his best feats of his career. He actually signs a separate peace with the Turks just in time for his men north. And with Barclay, Tolly, and Bagration arguing all the time, Alexander finally says, okay, whatever, Kutuzov's in charge. Kutuzov did not want to fight at Borodino. And Alexander Alexander and others said, you must fight for Moscow. We can't just give it up to Napoleon. Once again, to your strategic point, you will force the enemy to fight 9 times out of 10. So he fights Borodino. He handled the army very poorly, I would say. Borodino is a Russian defeat. And I say this because it's often portrayed as, oh, you know, it's actually more like a Russian victory. I'm like, no, it's not. The French lost a lot of men. That's true. It's not a great French victory. But the Russians lost more men. They had horrible desertion afterwards, and the army was incapable of hard combat for over a month. Plus, all the bickering starts all over again. Anyway, he eventually was Kutuzov was. Alexander also considered relieving Kutuzov, blaming him for Borodino. But, you know, Bagration was dead, Barclay was sick, and he knew Benningsig was too despised. So anyway, Kutuzov was essentially pathologically afraid of Napoleon. Considered Napoleon the greatest commander of all time, and therefore he said, we shouldn't fight him, we should wear him down. I mean, some people have called, oh, Kutuzov's a genius. He avoided battle with Napoleon. Really what it is that he allows Napoleon to escape. Now, one argument can be made that Kutuzov didn't want to have an aggressively anti-French foreign policy because Kutuzov did not trust Britain. He thought Napoleon was a good counterweight against the British. And, you know, Kutuzov is also one of those kind of guys who's like, hey, you know, Britain's not our friend. They're just using us to fight a war for them.
So he understood the British.
He did understand the British. At the same time, I would say Kutuzov was a very cautious commander, and numerous times where he could have just smashed up Napoleon's army, he didn't take advantage of. Napoleon had a very low opinion of Kutuzov. He considered him a moron. Kutuzov could have captured Napoleon in Russia. I have no doubt about it. Anyway, fun fact, Kutuzov was pretty sick during this whole time. In fact, at Borodino, he famously was too ill to really get up. And he was also a fat guy, so he couldn't get a horse. He then died suddenly. There was conspiracy theories that Kutuzov had been poisoned by Alexander because of how openly he was against pursuing the French, you know, past Russian territory. And that getting rid of Kutuzov got rid of a super popular Russian general who was openly opposed to your policy. I mean, Alexander, Kutuzov would live, Kutuzov would have to command the army in 1813. Because regardless of how one feels about his pursuit of Napoleon, he did ultimately follow Napoleon, win some battles, and inflict heavy losses. So in the minds of the Russian people and the Russian nobles, he's a fucking hero. Right? But he died suddenly. I'll leave that up to you to decide whether or not you think he was poisoned. But it's one of those conspiracy theory type things where if somebody told me, I'd be like, yes, there's a motive and a will, and it's not super complicated, you know?
So, remember earlier you talked about how Alexander had sort of an oddity in his personality where he showed favoritism to everyone to their face. Do you think that maybe that is responsible for a lot of the feuding between Kutuzov and Barclay and Bagration and all these other guys, that Alexander didn't really reveal his true kind of feelings? Do you think that that's contributed to a lot of this backbiting?
Possibly. I mean, keeping in mind, a lot of these guys, it's like, how'd you feel about Tsar Paul's murder plays a part in these factions? You know? It should be noted, though, Kutuzov was good at taking care of his men, and he did have one ability. Of all the Russian generals of these wars, he's the one who is best able to get along with the other Russian officers and get the best out of them.
So in a lot of ways, was he basically the compromise candidate?
Yeah, he's, you know, he kind of Eisenhower-esque in a way, like not a military genius, but he does have some talents, and one of those talents is actually managing some very difficult personalities.
Huh.
When I say he was good at managing his troops, I mean, you know, keep in mind these guys are nobles. Bagration's beloved because he's brave, right? Kutuzov was popular with the men because they knew that he would keep them well-fed, well-armed, you know? He wasn't going to throw away their lives in a useless attack. I don't think Kutuzov is necessarily a bad general. I just think he's an overrated general. That's all.
I see.
I mean, when I did a paper on Napoleon's retreat years back, I was kind of like, this guy could get Napoleon any minute, but he doesn't. like I said, some of that's political considerations, but I will say Kutuzov was kind of pathologically afraid of Napoleon. He would openly tell people, like, this guy's a military genius. We're better off not fighting him in a battle. So he would say that continuously. I don't know. Maybe a D.
Another victory for Russia.
Yeah, their generals suck.
Speaking of people who suck, next up we have Karl Mack von Lieberich. Who,
unfortunate.
Yeah, I did a good amount of research on him because I was curious about how he got where he was. And suffice it to say, he is the all-time champion at social networking to get beyond your ability.
Yeah, he is one of those, man. He should they should remake the Social Network with him, right?
Yeah, I mean, because this motherfucker knew everybody who was anybody, and that is pretty much the only reason why he's ever in command of an army, as far as I can tell.
One thing I thought was interesting that when I read about him years back was that he was ousted from the army by Ernest Loudon. You know Loudon?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's one of the best Austrian generals of the 7 Years' War. I kind of feel like if that guy doesn't like you, maybe something's wrong. You know? Loudon was a no-nonsense, Loudon wasn't the kind of guy to be like, oh, you have a high social standing. I'm going to be afraid. No, Loudon wants results, you know? Anyway, I think what happened to him was he suffered a head wound. I think that explains his actions. He was in the Neapolitan army for a time, quarreled with Nelson, feared a mutiny, so he fled, only to be captured by the French.
Oh, yeah, that was funny.
Yeah. Well, Charles championed peace and reform. He championed, let's get back at the French right away. And, of course, the Austrian nobility, the bulk of them, are dumb enough to make Mack their hero and say, we're going to do this. Mack says that we should. And then, of course, given command of one of the two principal field armies. Now, to be fair, Archduke Ferdinand's actually in charge, but, Mack's really the one calling the shots.
Yeah, I guess he technically was serving as chief of staff, but it was understood that he was in command.
Yeah. I mean, Ferdinand's one of those real empty-headed Austrian nobles as well, so it's known who's in charge. Napoleon, though, marched very quickly on Mack's position. Mack remained inactive. And by the time he understood there was also some French spies, gave him false information. By the time he knew what was going on, his breakout attempts failed. And then Ferdinand started to question him in front of the men. So Mack was technically in charge. Ferdinand would suddenly assert his authority in a negative way. And eventually he has to surrender his entire force at Ulm. By the way, Ferdinand did escape with some of the cavalry, but they were chased and sliced up by Murat's horsemen. So yeah, he lost a series of battles and then surrendered 30,000 men. Pretty horrible defeat, huh?
The unfortunate Mack.
That's right. He introduced himself. He called himself the unfortunate Mack, and Bonaparte told him, I give back to the unfortunate general his sword and his freedom, along with my regards to give to his emperor. So Napoleon sent him the Austrian court as a peace offering, like, hey, I'm here to negotiate. Instead, they threw him in jail.
Yeah, I remember he got thrown in jail for a couple of years, and then he was stripped of all his ranks until 1819. Apparently, Schwarzenberg went to bat for him to restore his honor.
Yeah, by that time the wars are over, and you kind of have that reconciliation idea of like, hey, let's not be entirely a jerk to this guy, right?
Right.
Yeah, Mack was aggressive. He had some strategic insight. When Napoleon first did his march, he kind of saw like, hey, I've got a chance to cut him off. But the problem is I think the head wound probably affected him. He was bickering with Ferdinand. He would make complicated plans, and he just pointlessly argue with people as well. So, yeah, I mean, he's pretty bad. What do you think of Mack?
He's the monster Mack. He's the Mack attack.
The Mack attack. Oh God.
I don't know, man. I mean, you know, we used to do that in the Napoleonic War game. Anytime I played as Austria, I would send in Mac and see if I could get a cheap victory, you know, against the odds. But
that's what Danny did. Danny's Mac just kept fucking winning, and then I remember one time you avoided battle because you're like, "Look, I've learned enough to know that you don't fuck with Mac."
yeah, no, he did that. Then I think I did that one time, although mine was way less successful, but still did way better than it should have. Yeah, there's something about the Mac piece in that game. Even though he has no special powers at all, like, there's something about him. He's got like a certain aura.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I don't know. He's got to be pretty damn low. I mean, he's got to be what, an E or an F. I can't really see him being much more than that. I feel like maybe he's sort of like got the Paulus problem of being a staff officer who was then put in command and hadn't really had the necessary experience actually being in charge.
In part, yeah. Although it should be noted that the way that the German staff system worked by the time we get to World War II, being a staff officer was kind of almost like a how can I say this, man? Like it was pretty good training for commanding an army or an army group. You know, one of the principles was that a German chief of staff in the Prussian system for World War I and World War II was seen as kind of a co-commander, so it was seen as important that he would get along with his commanding officer. And there was also a principle that if the staff officer thought the commanding officer was doing something stupid, they could override them. Although it was understood in the German army that's not something you would do very often. And that was something that was instituted mostly when the German army still had a lot of nobles in it who may not know what they're doing, right? So I do want to say that, you know, like Paulus is kind of a different story, I think.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. I got to go with an F.
Yeah,
Agree, man?
I agree. I can't really think of a reason why he shouldn't be an F. I mean, unless we count Danny's performance with Mac in that one game.
Yeah.
Because that's like the only possible argument to get him out of the F column, really. All right. What?
Who's our next guy? Pasha?
Next up we have Ahmad Pasha al-Jazzar.
Yeah, what'd you read about him?
Well, I read about his background. This guy was basically an Ottoman governor of Sidon. He actually relocated the capital to Acre. Originally, he served under the Mamluks, and he was a Bosnian slave who had been sold to the Mamluks. He grew up to become basically an enforcer/assassin. So, you know, basically a street tough, but then he rose through the ranks. He left to go to the Near East, and apparently the Ottomans hired him to fight against a rebel. He successfully defended a city or two, and later on was appointed to be governor in 1776, and stayed as governor of Sidon until his death in 1804. So he was well entrenched by the time Napoleon arrived, and this guy is no joke. I mean, like I said, the guy was an assassin professionally before he, you know, went into Ottoman service, and they trusted him enough that when they had openings at Damascus, they would sometimes allow him to govern that province as well. So the Ottomans were willing to entrust him with a good deal of authority at a time when they couldn't quite trust what was going on in Egypt with the Mamluks, and so clearly this is a guy who is not to be trifled with, and I would imagine one of the more ruthless opponents in Napoleon.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I read about him was that he was known for issuing heavy taxes and was liberal with executions, particularly of Jews and Christians.
That's what I read about Murad Bey.
Well, I mean,
it could be true of both of them, though.
Could be true of both of them. We also understand, like you know, the Middle East, the 1700s, is how can I say, is one of the reasons. One of the reasons on the decline is that you still have a series of governments that are becoming known more for their viciousness than anything else.
Yeah.
Right?
Also, by the way, al-Jazzar means the butcher, so he's not known for his gentle approach to government.
Yeah. Oh my God.
So, you know, we're not talking about the nicest guy to ever govern this area.
Yeah, no, he the butcher. God. One of the most fascinating men in this era is Nadir Shah. You know about him?
No, not really.
Oh, he's probably the last great Central Asian conqueror. Essentially, he was a bandit who became a commander, and of course, eventually he usurped the throne. And most famous exploit was he invaded India, destroyed the Indian army, and then sacked Delhi. He stole so much loot that he actually voided taxes in Persia for a year. So anyway, Nadir Shah, you look him up sometime. Fascinating guy. I mention him though because when I read about the campaigns, you know, if you usurp somebody back then in the Middle East, what you run into is they won't just usurp like the throne and like kill, say, a king and like some relatives, right? No, they'll wipe up the entire court, which could include like astronomers, poets. Get my drift?
Yeah.
Like in Europe, as brutal as things would be in the 1700s, they're not as brutal as they were 200 years before. And more importantly, if Frederick the Great, you know, like the Austrian army marches into Berlin, they don't execute scientists, you know? So yeah, somebody like the Butcher here is indicative of one of the problems of administration in the Middle East at this time.
And also, it doesn't seem like Ottoman control is very strong. Yeah. We'll get back to that when we talk about Murad Bey, but yeah, the Ottomans are not exactly, you know, really holding their empire together very firmly at this time.
And they're relying on guys like this, who's only, I mean, I say his only real talent, he's this talent he has in spades, but it's the ability to hold on to power and keep an area secure, right?
Yeah.
That said, he defies Napoleon and defeats him.
Yeah, and also by the time that Napoleon arrived, he had been consolidating his power for 20 years, fairly constant campaigner, fought against all kinds of different rebels, mostly small-scale wars, but still pretty much universally successful.
Also fought against the Russians, I've read as well.
Yeah, he beat the Russian Navy at Beirut at one point, so... actually, this guy, so far as I know, never lost a battle. I mean, I might be wrong about that, but I didn't see anything that implied that he had ever suffered defeat.
I think we have a candidate for the A tier.
Yeah, I mean, we got somebody who's clearly good at killing people.
God. This is the most horrible person on this list.
We're like, I mean, he's but you know, if you want young Napoleon to be hardened enough to face Russia, I mean, having him fight the Butcher is probably a pretty good warm-up match, you know?
Man, oh my God, we got Brunswick, who's like patron of the arts and reads enlightened philosophy, and then we've got the Butcher, and we're like, Brunswick's an F, the Butcher's an A.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I mean, this isn't about how cool they were at court or their level of learnedness. I mean, this is about if they can lead armies to victory, and apparently the Butcher was pretty talented in that regard, even if he probably had no other skills. Aside from being able to sneak in a house and slit somebody's throat. Which is, you know, pretty related, I suppose.
You should do a biography video on this guy. Be like, I want to talk about the Butcher.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of the clicks I'd get if I just said the biography of the Butcher, they'd be like, oh, it's some serial killer video.
Or they'll think it's Bill the Butcher from Gangs in New York.
Yeah. But,
so... You want to move on to Sidney Smith, I believe, is the next one, right?
Yes. Now we have our first British guy, Sidney Smith.
And by the way, one of the reasons we don't have a lot of Brits or Spanish commanders on here is Napoleon really didn't face a bunch of them. So now, Napoleon did campaign in Spain in 1808. I didn't really include them on there because, for one thing, a lot of those battles that he fought were foregone conclusions. And... more interesting Spanish generals were guys like Castastanos and Blake, who Napoleon didn't face off again. You know? But anyway, Sidney Smith's kind of an esoteric choice, but I wanted to put him on here because Napoleon had such high praise for the guy. I thought it was interesting. You know? So Sidney Smith came to the British aristocracy, joined the Navy, did very well in the American Revolution, and actually served the Swedish fleet for a time. his expertise was using naval ships to support land operations, and he did so at Toulon in 1793, which Napoleon was present at, and then the English Channel. That would include raids, of course, as well. He was captured for a time, but then was given a command of a ship in the Mediterranean. So, Smith was given a free hand in the region, and he actually knew the Turks pretty well. So he supplied the Butcher with weapons and marines. And he also raided the coast, destroying supplies, and seized some of Napoleon's siege guns as well. Napoleon attacks Acre and fails. It's kind of like a joint effort by the Butcher and Smith. Now, I think it's more the Butcher than anything else. He's the commander in Acre. But, Smith gave him valuable supplies and performed those valuable raids.
Yeah, I mean, Acre was actually the headquarters of the Butcher. He had actually more or less moved the capital out of Sidon just on his own initiative, and especially fortified the city. So there's no way he'd be yielding command to Sidney Smith.
Yeah, no, definitely. But Smith bickered with Horatio Nelson. Now, Nelson's an interesting guy. That naval guy, the naval YouTube channel right now, Drachenfell, I can't pronounce it. Great channel though, but he's doing Nelson's life, and I'm liking it because Nelson's fascinating. He definitely deserves the high praise he receives as a tactician and leader. But Nelson had some problems. His personal life was a mess, and once Nelson became kind of famous, he became infamous for insubordination. In fact, he was fairly insubordinate even before that. And one of the things I found reading about Nelson was that whereas a guy like Wellington was actually a bit of a Francophile, Nelson literally despised whoever Britain's opponents were. So he hated the French and the Americans. So Smith, Nelson actually wanted to institute much more cruel punishments on the French when they in Egypt than Smith wanted to. Should be also noted, probably Nelson's most notorious thing was executing various rebels in Italy, in southern Italy, in Naples. Even though people were pleading for their lives, he just hanged them anyway. Summary execution, well, essentially war crimes. So there's Horatio Nelson for you. Great admiral, but he could be a vicious son of a bitch. But anyway, so Smith did well. The rest of the Napoleonic Wars, various other naval commands. He was one of those guys who supported the abolition of slavery. That meant not just the Atlantic slave trade with Africa, but also the Barbary pirates. This is something that's forgotten. The Barbary pirates of North Africa would raid the coast and capture people and enslave them, right? And, that includes lots of Europeans. Of course, I mean, a number of Americans were slaves of the Barbary pirates. So, Smith was trying to launch a war against them to end the cruel practices. Fun fact, he was forced to flee to France due to his debts.
Oh, wow.
I love how these guys are debtors, don't you, man?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense that they're so focused on other things that they probably just gamble like mad to relieve stress. And I guess in the case of the British officers, they also had to buy their ranks, which doesn't help the debt situation.
Yeah. I think Smith probably would have had a higher reputation and rank if not for the fact that he bickered with Nelson. And then Nelson dies at Trafalgar, so now he becomes like the ultimate hero, right? That said, Napoleon lavished praise on him. He said of Sidney Smith, "That man ruined my destiny," because when Napoleon invades Egypt, he's not thinking about how am I going to become ruler of France. He's actually thinking, how am I going to create a Middle Eastern empire like Alexander the Great? I mean, it's a total pipe dream, So basically,
Napoleon was aiming for Alexander with the backup plan of becoming Seleucus.
I mean, I would even argue Napoleon becoming ruler of France is more or less just him flying by the seat of his pants, seeing the opportunity and seizing it, not so much like a calculated assassination, but that's my opinion.
So do you think it's safe to say that the Butcher is the main reason why he did not achieve his dream, or...?
Yeah, probably so. He probably should have given a little more praise to the Butcher, but without a doubt, Smith played an important role. And I would kind of think that one of the reasons Napoleon admired Sidney Smith was that Sidney Smith was this jack of all trades, sailor, general, diplomat, charismatic, intelligent. I think he just admired Smith, which is also important because considering how much Napoleon's of an Anglophobe at this point. Now, bear in mind, when Napoleon was a younger man, he seems to have actually admired the British, in particular the banking system. He adopted variant of their banking system in France, which still exists to this day. That said, I believe Sidney Smith was the kind of guy he would admire later life. You know? So, I don't know. What do you make of Smith? What would you rate him?
I guess he's a little hard to rate in that sense as a Napoleon opponent because, I mean, he was important at a key moment in Napoleon's life. I don't know, maybe a C?
I go with a B myself, you know? I could see a C either way.
Yeah, we can go with B. That way Blucher can have a friend.
Yeah, he's kind of lonely, isn't he?
I mean, Blucher without a friend or subordinate is pretty much useless, so, you know, we gotta give him somebody to help him out.
Yeah, you got him, man.
All right, next up we have another Austrian, Karl Philippe, Prince of Schwarzenberg.
Yeah, fascinating guy. Cavalry officer, fought against the Turks. He was actually saved by Poniatowski, the Polish hero. In the French Revolutionary Wars, he did pretty well. I guess has a good reputation. He's especially known for his charisma and his lack of enemies. So if you've got an Austrian high command that's increasingly racked with infighting, Schwarzenberg becomes one of the few people who is acceptable to most of the factions. He did escape the trap at Ulm. And he's the guy who in 1808 actually helps convince the Russians not to press the Austrians too much. What's interesting, though, is that Napoleon, he helped arrange the marriage between Napoleon and Marie-Louise, so Napoleon actually liked Schwarzenberg and requested that he lead the Austrian army in Russia. So the Austrians did send a force that helped out in the invasion of Russia. And in 1813, he becomes the commander of the main Austrian army, but also like the Grand Field Marshal the entire war. So Schwarzenberg is the one overseeing the overall war effort in 1813 to 14. However, he knew the Austrian army could ill afford heavy losses because they had been fighting these wars for so long that it was becoming hard to raise troops. And he also knew their finances were in a mess. Rulers of Austria, Russia, and Prussia and their courts were all attached to his command. That sound like fun to you?
Hell no. Sounds like Eisenhower's situation, but on steroids.
Yeah. I'll say this. Schwarzenberg mishandled the Battle of Dresden. He didn't play a decisive role at Leipzig. And he did win some victories in France in 1814, though, and he's the man who takes Paris. And led the Austrian forces in 1815 as well. That said, he kind of died prematurely out of a stroke. It's a little hard to rate him. He's a rather cautious army commander. I don't envy the position that he's in, though. You know?
Yeah, I feel like he's less a soldier by the time he gets to high command and more of a, like a, what would be the word? Somebody who's entrusted with full powers. He's almost like a really good political general, more so than a traditional general.
Yeah, he's a good soldier diplomat.
Yeah,
right?
Plenipotentiary.
Yeah. So I find it really hard to rate him. What do you think?
I mean, he's clearly very talented. Being able to keep the coalition together, keep everybody happy, command an army, even if he doesn't do so, super well, but still keep the army in the field while also having to deal with everybody from his allies.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how well he actually did, but the fact that he was able to do what he did is pretty impressive. I mean, I'm thinking he's probably at least a C or a B.
I'd go with the C myself. His handling at Dresden, his tactical handling is pretty bad, as he said.
Dresden was directly against Napoleon, right?
Yeah.
What other battles did he fight Napoleon head on were both their commanders?
Maybe something in France, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. I mean, a lot of very small, not very, very small, but like a lot of small battles were fought in France. in 1814. And I'll admit, of all the Napoleonic campaigns, it's the one I know the least about. But I know Napoleon fought Blucher a lot in 1814. But, I mean, handling of Dresden is not very good. Dresden's one of Napoleon's last great victories. In fact, I think if not for Culm, you're talking like Austerlitz level with Dresden. I mean, the coalition forces suffer heavy losses and are driven from the field. I don't know, but he's in a tough position. I kind of think of him more like a D, honestly.
So you want to go C?
But if you want to go with C, I say you're on the higher end. Let's go with C then.
All right, yeah, because I feel like we do have to keep in mind that he does have other responsibilities aside from just commanding the army, and it doesn't seem like there's anybody else who has the ability to keep the coalition happy. No one else has the political skills. I mean, Alexander's a little weird, and Blucher's belligerent, and so I feel like, yeah, he does play a role in keeping this coalition going into France.
I mean, look, he's no butcher, but, you know, I mean...
Yeah. I mean, unlike the butcher, he doesn't rely on terror to keep his allies together. The butcher had it figured out.
The butcher had it figured out, man.
Yeah. You build up a reputation as a hitman, and then you become a small-time warlord.
Yeah.
Call it a career. All right. Next up, we have Michael Andreas Barclay de Tolly.
Yeah, I think this is probably the best Russian general. Barclay actually came from Scottish Highlanders, settled in Estonia in the 1600s. How do you like that?
Wow. Okay.
You know, you had in the Baltic states in particular, you had a variety of people from all over Europe who had settled there. You increasingly have nationalism and a kind of proto-racism, or at least racism as we would understand today, being formed at the time. So a lot of Russian officers didn't trust them because they're like, oh, look at this Scotsman. But Barclay was also kind of had a cold personality. So even though he had a great talent for administration, a good military record, he was not a beloved by the soldiers or fellow officers. Was brave, though. He suffered a wound at Eylau, for instance. And during the Finnish War, he made a rapid march across the frozen lake Gulf of Bothnia. So he was made Minister of War, and he was one of the people who was not enthusiastic about Alexander's desire to go to war. And many thought that Russia's sluggish mobilization in 1811 was due to his opposition. So that's how he becomes unpopular. Now, when Napoleon gathered a massive horde to invade Russia, the actual purpose of that was to scare the Russians into giving up before he even had to pull the trigger. Barclay's answer to that was to retreat. Burning crops to starve Napoleon, scorched earth. But the men publicly booed Barclay. We cheered Bagration. Bagration, of course, refused to work with him. So after the defeat at Smolensk, Alexander I considered Barclay his best commander. That was his favorite. He knew that he was too unpopular, so he replaced him with Kutuzov. Barclay stayed in command. Now, Barclay did something pretty brilliant. At Borodino, he fought all along the front lines, rallying men, and this made him suddenly go from being, I wouldn't say beloved, but he goes from being despised to respected. And whereas Barclay had been seen as somebody who didn't want to really fight Napoleon, he's one of the guys who really tells Alexander after Borodino, fight to the bitter end, we can beat him. 1813, though, he wasn't at first given command of the army, but after Wittgenstein was defeated, Barclay was put in command, did superbly at Leipzig. He was amongst the first to enter Paris, and he led the Russian army in 1815 when it was mobilized for the Waterloo campaign, although they never fought a major battle. You know, Waterloo pretty much decided things before that. Barclay, I think, was the best of the commanders. He was a good strategic mind, excellent administrator. He was very brave. His lack of charisma, though, made it to where guys like Kutuzov, Bagration, and Milodrovich remained the real favorites of the soldiers and people afterwards. But Barclay, he was the best of the commanders. I give him a B, honestly.
Is it a B?
Yeah, I give him a B.
Okay. Pretty solid. Next up, we have someone else who is known for being pretty good. Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington.
Yeah, you. What's your opinion of Wellington overall?
I feel like most of the impressive stuff he did was in the Iberian Peninsula. So I guess the question is, are we rating him on his generalship overall, or on his performance against Napoleon in the two battles they faced each other?
I would say overall during the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay, so that changes things. He was pretty instrumental in building an Anglo-Portuguese coalition army, and also in helping the Spanish in their efforts to overthrow the French occupation. I don't think that Spain was necessarily the decisive element in overthrowing Napoleon's empire. When combined with the Russian campaign, it did immense amounts of damage. So Wellington was absolutely instrumental in inflicting a lot of that damage. He humiliated a number of marshals.
Yeah.
I think he probably could have done a little better in his invasion of South France. I get the impression that he almost got bottled up and destroyed by Soult at one point. So he didn't put as much pressure as he could have during the 1814 campaign, for instance, which was a fairly close run, even though, as we mentioned earlier, Schwarzenberg captured Paris. So I feel like Wellington, was a very good general, but I think he is a little overrated just because the British tend to want to have these grand heroes.
Yeah.
He clearly got his ass kicked at Quarter Bras, and he might have been able to make a draw of it at Waterloo without Blucher, but most likely he would have lost. So, those are kind of my thoughts on him. Also, this whole reverse slope thing that he's famous for, it doesn't sound like that big of a tactical innovation to me. It sounds kind of like common sense, but apparently this is something that he took credit for more or less figuring out. I don't know if you can tell us more about the reverse slope tactic and if that was something that predates Wellington in any way.
It predates Wellington for sure. He just became known for using it. He figured out it was a way to beat the French system. I think he's one of the most fascinating commanders of all time personally. I just find his personal story so odd and interesting. I mean, he comes from the kind of like Anglo-Irish aristocracy. Hated being at school, loved France. A lifelong Francophone. But anyway, when he joins the army, he was known for gambling, drinking, and playing the violin. Know about this?
No.
Yeah, he loved playing the violin. His brother Richard was considered the rising star, and the only reason he had the rank of lieutenant colonel when he did, which was about 1793, was because of family, money, and connection. Well, he proposed to a woman named Catherine Packingham, turned him down. This, along with the French Revolution, really broke Wellington a lot of ways. He started Catherine turned him down, essentially saying, "You're a silly man. Nobody takes you seriously." At the same time, some of his very own friends he'd made in France, younger, were being executed. So the way the story goes is that he one night burned his violin, gave up drinking and gambling, completely devoted himself to soldiering with the intention of breaking France. Now, if I were to give Wellington, say there are two defects of Wellington as a commander. One is that he was a bit of a micromanager and could be very hard on his fellow officers. He kind of had the opinion that the average British officer was borderline incompetent. To be fair, Flanders campaign during the French Revolutionary Wars is not the British Army at its best. Also, to be
anytime you have a system where people buy their commissions, that does not tend to encourage competence.
True, and of course the government invests more money in the Navy. That said, your average British soldier and their firing techniques are superb. So Wellington's opinion was the materials of the army are excellent. The officers are not. But I would say that Wellington kind of saw himself as the superior to everyone, especially as the years went on. Some of the officers you would rate lowly, I wouldn't rate as lowly as he did. You know.
Yeah.
As far as the men go, he wasn't loved or hated. I mean, he could be brave in battle and knew how to rally troops. For discipline, he was known for being hard but fair. I mean, keeping in mind the British Army's discipline is arguably the most hardcore of any of these armies, with the possible exception of the Russians. His other defect is one you already kind of alluded to with the Pyrenees campaign. I think Wellington was not very good at operational maneuver. Talavera campaign, for instance, operational maneuver, not very good. It's not even a victory. The campaign's a defeat. He does manage to win the Battle of Talavera, which is good for morale, but the campaign's a failure. For Gokes, he gets outmaneuvered. He gets outmaneuvered on the eve of Waterloo. But I think on operational maneuver, that's one of his weak points. That being said, in terms of tactics, he's superb. And keeping in mind, he's holding together this small army that one bad defeat would be a disaster. And he also made the important decision of ensuring that Lisbon was fortified. That way he had a base he could fall back to, that as long as there was no big mistakes, that base would be unassailable. You know, the French Navy can't stop the British from flying it, right?
Right.
So strategically, he's very good as well. I have this quote of his that I think is excellent. So anyway, he had already fought in India and done very well. He was sent over, and he wrote in a letter, he said, the French, have a new system of strategy which has outmaneuvered and overwhelmed all the armies of Europe. They may overwhelm me. I don't think they will outmaneuver me. First, because I'm not afraid of them. Everybody else seems. And secondly, because what I hear of their system maneuver is true, I think it a false one as against steady troops. I suspect all the continental armies were more than half beaten before the battle begun. I, at least, will not be frightened beforehand. Now, he wins the Battle of Vimeiro, which is essentially Britain's first major victory since 1780, you know, outside of some stuff in India. He manages the army very well, the logistics, like you mentioned with the Portuguese army. There's a handful of battles here and there that he'll lose in his career. A lot of very British historians will be like, oh, Wellington never lost a battle. Like, yeah, he did. He just never lost a big battle. But he lost a variety of smaller ones, right? Like you mentioned Courte Bras. It's a defeat, but it's not a sweeping defeat. You know what I'm saying? It's a defeat you can recover from. Anyway, after that, he became a Tory prime minister. He opposed, fun fact, he opposed voting reform and expansion of Jewish rights, but supported Catholic emancipation.
Yeah, from what I understand, he was very conservative in his politics.
Very. The actual nickname, the Iron Duke, comes from the fact that he had to put iron shutters on his windows because people were breaking the windows out in opposition to his politics.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Wasn't he also not super favorable to reforms in the army when they consulted him after the wars?
Yes. Now, there's a few historians have said, oh, we've probably been too mean to him, but I think by the time he's made commander, he's forgetful, he's very old, increasingly bitter, and, you know, he left the British Army in some disarray, which leads to near disaster in the Crimean War. Which, by the way, everybody, I want to recommend something to you if you can find it. Obscure movie from 1968 called Charge the Light Brigade. One of my favorite war movies ever, and it's hilarious. You got to pay attention to the dialogue. And one of the funny things about the movie is that while you have the Lord Raglan and Airy and the other guys are in like the British War Office planning stuff, there's just a giant statue of Wellington outside the window because they made a big statue of him, right? But they haven't decided where they're going to put it yet. So the whole time they're talking, there's like this giant like statue head of Wellington staring at them, you know?
Wow.
Yeah, you ever seen that movie, Derek?
I haven't.
Oh, dude, like it can be hard to find. Like, it's obscure, it's out of print, but really look it up. I think you'd love it.
So basically, Pirate Bay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But even Pirate Bay will take you some time. By the way, it's the way I call it the Marxist war movie. So class heavy.
All right. Well, I'm definitely gonna look into it now.
Yeah, it's a wonderful film. But anyway, from what I've read, Wellington made a few modifications here and there, in particular with some things to do with officer selection, I believe, but overall not a very effective commander of an army. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of like when Sheridan was put in command of the U.S. Army. He wasn't very good either. That's because Sheridan was near death's door, you know?
Yeah. Also, what about the mistress story with Wellington?
Oh, yeah, I was just about to get to that, man. Yeah, so he... Wellington... Wellington was obsessed with Napoleon. Okay? I mean, like variety commanders would be, but there's this tendency with... I mean... Okay, a lot of great commanders, when they face off against each other, will kind of insult each other. Famous example would be Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. You read their opinions of each other, you can tell they're upset that the other guy got over on them. You know what I mean? Because obviously Grant joins Meade's army to face Lee so he can beat the Confederacy's best general, right? And I don't mean that Grant and Lee didn't have some critiques, the other one that were not pertinent. They did, but it kind of strikes me as very, very petty. Pretty bad between Napoleon and Wellington. Napoleon straight up said Wellington's a bad general. And he mentioned a variety of errors he made at Waterloo, and he said, I got beat by Blucher, you know, and I think some of that is Napoleon just being upset that that was his last battle, right? Wellington, on the other hand, would actually praise Napoleon in public, but that's because it made his victory at Waterloo all the greater. In private, he would say Napoleon's overrated. In fact, he studied a variety of his campaigns and declared that Napoleon probably had no plan of action, which in many ways was true. Napoleon was more flexible than Wellington, though. But he was essentially looking for ways to declare how mediocre he was. Now, fun thing, 3 things that he did. He started collecting Napoleonic memorabilia. The 3 that are interesting is he would collect Napoleonic gold coins, and that's what he would use at gambling tables. He was betting on stuff later in life. At the same time, he had a naked statue of Napoleon that if you entered his palace, that's what would greet you. That was in the foyer, in, you know, the entranceway, right? And then he also tracked down Napoleon's mistresses and slept with 2 of them.
And didn't he ask them afterwards who was better?
No, I just imagine him doing that.
Oh, okay.
You know, like...
that would... I always thought that was part of the story. Never mind.
Yeah, it just... you know, he was a man who's like, I beat Napoleon, and yet I'm in his shadow. You know what I'm saying? The emotional thing, though, he tried to control his emotions so much there would be outbursts of anger, but also of emotion. So, you know, they're probably one of the best things ever was after Waterloo. And then keeping in mind, Waterloo, a variety of officers had died, like General Picton had been killed, who had been fighting under Wellington's command for years. He's one of the best fighting commanders the British have. Members of his staff were wounded. One of them in particular was Uxbridge. Now, Uxbridge, Wellington didn't like Uxbridge. He was his cavalry commander and second in command. And when I say Wellington didn't like Uxbridge, Uxbridge goes up to Wellington before the battle begins and says, hey, in case you get wounded, what's the plan? And he says, all he said was, my plan is to beat the French. Because he hated Uxbridge so much. But he saw Uxbridge get his leg taken off during the battle. So a variety of officers and even... people said that when he saw this guy, who he didn't like, but he saw his leg get taken off by a cannonball, he was visibly affected. And he wrote this letter afterwards where he was talking about how it's a near-run thing. And keep that in mind. Later in life, he'd be like, oh, well, Waterloo was easy. But if you read his letter afterwards, you can tell it's written by a man on the brink of disaster. And he has one of my favorite lines ever in all of warfare. He wrote, my heart is broken by the terrible loss I've sustained in my old friends and companions and my poor soldiers. Believe me, nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won. I love reading his stuff. Like, kind of like William Tecumseh Sherman. He knows how to turn a phrase. Witty. That said, his conservative politics were considered pretty hardcore even for their time. I don't think he understood that revolution. I think he was one of those guys also who thought that now that we beat the French Revolution, revolution's over, not coming back, which that wasn't true.
Yeah.
I like what Byron had to say about Wellington. You are the best of cutthroats, do not start. Phrases Shakespeare's and not misapplied. War is a brain-splattering, windpipe-slitting art. Right?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, goes on. Unless her cause by right be sanctified. If you have acted once a generous part, the world, not the world's masters, will decide. And I shall be delighted to learn who, save you and yours, have gained by Waterloo.
Ouch.
Yeah. So he's essentially saying, like, yeah, you're a great guy and all, but, you're great at killing people, and it's all just for, a bunch of aristocrats. Which, keep in mind, this is Lord Byron. Exactly not an aristocrat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's Lord Byron, man. The prototype of the limousine liberal.
Yeah, I guess he kind of is. That's I never thought of it that way, but I think you're right.
Kind of is, but he's got way more charisma. He's much more interesting than your average busybody. But anyway, Wellington, a fascinating man. I do think he's one of the greatest generals of the era and of all time.
Of all time? Huh.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to put him up there with Alexander, but think about it. He took on Napoleon. Now, granted, Blucher's decisive, and here's a fun story about that, too. I was going to paint Wellington's portrait a few years after Waterloo, and he was going to paint him with a clock in his hand, like a pocket watch. And Wellington said, no pocket watch. He said, if people see that, they'll think I'm waiting on Blucher. Yeah, I mean, once again, this guy's funny. I don't like his politics, but he's hilarious,
Yeah.
I do find him personally fascinating. As far as greatest generals, he took on... I think one of the things that impressed me about Wellington is that even though he has a very good army, he does have some problems. The British army, he has some bad officers to deal with. More importantly, the British artillery is inferior. Their cavalry... Their heavy cavalry is good. Their light cavalry, not quite so much. Their infantry are first rate. He does, however, find good officers like Picton, Hill, and a few other ones who serve him quite well. He is a very good tactician. I think what really impresses me is that he took on the best the French had. I mean, he didn't just beat a bunch of nobodies, right? He beats Soult. He beats Massena. He beats Napoleon. So I'm really impressed. I think he's S tier.
Okay.
But that said, once again, if he's got some flaws, and probably his biggest one is operational maneuver. Like you said, Soult almost caught him. Napoleon outmaneuvered him at Waterloo. His maneuvers at before and after Talavera are pretty bad.
Yeah, I get the sense. I know it's a criticism that gets leveled against Longstreet a lot, that his main defect is that he was a bit slow when it came to marching. I feel like that applies to Wellington.
Yeah, the British Army in general was not fleet of foot. Okay? Like the French are fast. The French actually had it set up with their music to increase a soldier's marching pace. The British don't. This is not a speedy army.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty impressed. I think he's a great one.
All right. Next up, we have Johann Peter de Beaulieu.
Beaulieu. What do you know about Beaulieu?
Not a damn thing.
Not a damn thing?
Yeah.
He's one of the oldest opponents Napoleon ever fought. He was born in 1725, and he fights Napoleon in 1796. I mean, he is not a spring chicken. He fought in the War of the Austrian Succession, one of the only ones. I think he's the only one on this list who did that.
Is he any relation to Trace Beaulieu of Mystery Science Theater fame?
Not that I know of. Oh, fun fact, he lived to be almost 100.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So anyway, Beaulieu, he had a very good career in his youth. He actually won the opening battle of the French Revolutionary Wars, which is a small battle at Mons. Anyway, he was sent to Italy in 1796, and he's got a difficult assignment. For one thing, it's considered a backwater, so he's not exactly commanding Austria's finest, you know. He also, the Austrians kind of knew that Piedmont was sort of looking to get out of the war. So they were telling him, hey, you can't really trust your allies. So he wasn't coordinating with them properly, although to be fair, he did apparently strike up a friendship with the Piedmont commander, who is Kali Marchi. But Napoleon opens his campaign. Actually, Baloo opened the campaign himself and confronted Napoleon, but Napoleon is in the end able to outmaneuver him and win a series of battles. After defeats like Lodi and Borghetto, he has to fall back all the way to Tyrol. Baloo, probably because he was very old, was known for being irritated and was trying to blame things on his subordinates. Of course, the Austrian army had a lot of intrigue going on, too. Keeping in mind, before this, Baloo had known mostly success. In fact, he'd done pretty well in the French Revolutionary War. So I think he also might have been shocked at, like, oh my God, I'm actually being beaten here, right?
Right.
So anyway, he was replaced with Wurmser, and Baloo went into retirement, understandably so. It's kind of funny. Baloo sometimes is really held in low regard. I actually think he's a better commander than people give him credit for. But definitely not a genius, over the hill. And he seems to have been a pretty good division commander, but army command seems to have been above his abilities. I'd give him an E.
All right, so our first E of the evening goes to Johann Peter de Baloo.
Yeah, too bad I don't have much to say about him. He's been described as, like, some people say that, you know, in the Italian campaigns, Napoleon just beat a series of elderly, incompetent Austrians. So he's sometimes called, like, Austrian General Number 1. I heard him jokingly called.
Or the Greybeards.
Yeah, I don't think that's fair to Wurmser, who we're going to talk about in a bit. I actually have kind of a good opinion of Wurmser, but that's a little different.
Yeah, he's a fairly impressive guy. I've looked him up. So you want to go on to Wurmser now?
Who's our next guy? Is it Wurmser? Or is
no, it's actually Michael von Melas.
Let's talk about
Austrian.
Because I barely know anything about him, except he almost won Marengo, but then he got wounded.
I looked up a little bit of stuff about him. He's also an older guy, born in 1729, entered the army age 17. Another guy born in Transylvania, although his ancestry is Saxon. During the 7 Years' War, he was an aide-de-camp. He was a colonel by 1781. He was a commander on the Rhine front, 1794-95. And then he led the Austrian army in Italy and served under Suvorov. Suvorov was the second coalition overall commander. The Austrians under von Melas won or contributed to victories at Cassano, Trebia, Novi, Genoa, the Siege of Genoa, and of course he most famously fought at Marengo, where he was not as successful.
But he came close. He surprised Napoleon. I mean, the one thing I've noticed about him is that he seems to have been a fairly aggressive and hard-hitting commander. Even though, despite his old age, he seems to have been pretty energetic. You know?
Yeah, I guess that's true. Even if we're talking about Boulot a minute ago, if a guy is spry enough to live to 100, then even at 60-something years old, probably still have a lot left in the tank, I would think.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Suvorov. Some people might be like, why isn't he on this list? Well, unfortunately, Napoleon never faced him. And I say unfortunately because, you know, Suvorov's one of the all-time greats of the era. You know?
Yeah.
It would have been great if, I mean, that'd be an interesting fight to see, like Napoleon versus Suvorov, you know?
What if Suvorov had still been alive at the time of Napoleon's invasion of Russia?
Oh, God, man, I don't know, dude.
Basically, Napoleon's empire ends in Russia, literally.
It should be noted the death of Suvorov does rob the Russians of a unifying. You know?
So is that part of why it's such a shit show later, where they don't really have a main guy to turn to?
I mean, partially. They are kind of all in Suvorov's shadow, and there are a lot of them debate like, I was Suvorov's favorite. No, I'm Suvorov's favorite. You know what I mean? Suvorov was it's a superb commander. You know, I just wish he'd fought Napoleon so we could rate him.
Fair enough.
Also, it should be noted Suvorov was, of all the Russian generals, was the one most studied by the Soviets. Yeah.
I guess that makes sense. I mean, he was the best, so...
Yeah, I think in Russian military circles, he's still considered one of, if not the best Russian general. I mean, barring maybe one of Stalin's commanders. But it should be noted Suvorov did more with less. They did. Not to denigrate all the Soviet commanders, but you have that many tanks, you got some advantages, right?
Yeah. I mean, and no one ever surpassed the military genius of Voroshilov.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody should know that we are going to do German and then Allied generals with a variety of Soviets, of course. So you can all expect that coming. And we will use Liberty or Death. I'm not Liberty or Death. We're going to use Operation Europe images.
Yeah, so those are very similar in style to the images we used for the American Revolution list from Liberty or Death. The games came out about the same time, 1993-ish.
Yeah, I got to give Milos a C, by the way.
Sounds fair. He definitely had some talents. I guess if he had just pressed his attack more at Marengo, I mean, he would be remembered as a beast.
Yeah, Marengo, the Shiloh of the Napoleonic Wars, right?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, similar situation. Take the enemy by surprise, throw them into disarray. The enemy reorganizes, counterattacks, and wins the day.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he's an interesting one, but now back to our good friend, Dagobert Sigmund von Wurmser.
You got any opinions on Wurmser?
Well, he's another one of these old guys, born in 1724. He is actually French. He was born in Strasbourg in French Alsace. He first served in the French army and the cavalry in the early 1840s during the Silesian Wars, so I guess against Frederick the Great. But then in 1750, his father decided to go to the Habsburg Empire for whatever reason. His son went with them, joined the Habsburg army, and apparently got a bunch of his men to come with him somehow. I guess that got him some rank, because now he was a relatively middle grade or senior grade officer. He did well against the Prussians in one of the Austro-Prussian wars, so Francis I actually made him a count. During the War of the Bavarian Succession, he was a general of the cavalry. He was the commander-in-chief in Austria's war with the Ottoman Empire in the 1780s. That was slightly after the War of the Bavarian Succession. And he also commanded the Imperial Army of the Rhine, 1793-94, and the Army of the Upper Rhine, 1795-96. During his tenure in the Imperial Army of the Rhine, he did manage to storm a defensive line held by the French Revolutionary armies, but then lost a battle at Second Wiesenberg to Hoche and Picheru. And then, of course, he went to Italy to face Napoleon.
Yeah, where he brawled with them, trying to relieve the siege of Mantua. Wurmser was defeated in the field battles he fought with Napoleon, but he did manage to reinforce and resupply the garrison. The main criticism I've heard of Wurmser is that instead that he fell back inside the city, instead of keeping his army out of the city. I think it's a little unfair. He didn't exactly retreat into the city with a massive horde of men. And he held on for a long, long time in there. I mean, the Siege of Mantua is one of the most epic sieges of this era of warfare, and I'd say probably of all the French Revolutionary Wars. So anyway, should be noted that he was allowed to march out of Mantua with full military honors, and Napoleon held him in high regard because Wurmser was a fighter. And should be noted that unlike some of these other generals who would go back to the Austrian court in disgrace, they considered that Wurmser had put up one hell of a fight. They blamed other people for the defeat, not him.
Yeah, apparently they were about to give him another command, but then he kind of dropped dead at the age of 72. So,
well, that siege was hard, I mean, I'm kind of shocked. They're like, hey, let's give him another command.
Yeah, because you'd think they'd want him to rest for a few months at least, but they're like, nah, we need him back out there. He's a good general.
What would you rate him?
Um, Based on his performance both in Italy and then before that on the Rhine, he sounds like he's a capable commander, but by no means a brilliant one. I think he's kind of a C-tier guy.
That sounds about right to me.
Yeah, I mean, he's got some balls, he can fight, he's got some experience, but ultimately he did get surrounded and forced to surrender, so he couldn't have been a genius.
Yeah, I kind of feel like he's a man who probably not a great independent commander, but makes one hell of a division or even corps commander, you know?
Yeah, and I don't even think he's necessarily incompetent, he's just kind of average.
Yeah, but at least he's a fighter.
Yeah, he's willing to fight, and did okay, but he happened to fight Napoleon, who he had no way to know was a military genius.
Not at that time. I mean, there was some evidence, but
But I mean, he was still just some upstart little punk kid. So I mean, if you're Wormser and you're over 70, you're probably not too worried by some 25, 26-year-old, however old Napoleon was.
Yeah, one thing about it too, I've a lot of historians think Napoleon's initial Italian campaign, the one where he defeats the Piedmont and drives off Belliu, is his most brilliant campaign of his career. I don't know if I go that far, but it was. I mean, he came out the gate swinging. Let's just say that.
Yeah, I think the Jena-Osterdat campaign would probably be his greatest success.
I think so too. But that initial the Italian campaign in general, but especially those initial maneuvers, very very impressive.
Although the 1805 campaign is also a strong contender. I mean, you have Ulm and then you have Austerlitz in the same year. So I mean, you basically defeat two large armies in pretty rapid succession.
Very true.
Pretty damn impressive too. So I don't know. It's I guess Napoleon has a lot of campaigns that could qualify.
Definitely does. He fought a lot.
Also, even his defense of France in 1814, even though he lost, he actually conducted it very competently and won a lot of the battles.
Yeah, Wellington had a high opinion of Napoleon's 1814 campaign. He said of the campaigns he studied of Napoleon's, he was most impressed by that one.
Yeah, that's one I want to read more about. I remember we played that one game, Napoleon at Bay, and I think I ended up more or less reproducing Napoleon's defense because I feel like I came really damn close to winning, but then Paris fell right on, I think, the last or second to last turn.
It's a lot of Austrian. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because there was one of the armies, because there were, what, 3 people. I think you were, I don't think you had an army. I think you were just running the game. There were 3 people. I think it must have been Danny, William, and Michael. In one of their armies, I think it was either Austrians or Russians, I managed to destroy their supply center on my first move, and they were pretty much fucked the entire game. Or at least half of it. So that helped a lot, but yeah, it's hard as hell to win unless you're getting really good die rolls. And of course, if you got Michael in the game, you're guaranteed to take massive losses because the dice love that man.
They do.
Especially when it rolls against me, more so than anybody else. Anyway. This changes everything.
It
does.
Like,
Michael, don't worry about it. All you gotta do is roll some dice and you'll be fine. It might not apply to anybody else. It might not make sense, but it always works for you. Just roll some dice and you will be out of difficulty immediately. Alright. Next up, we have Murad Bey.
Yeah, what do you know about Murad Bey?
Well, he is another fascinating individual from a declining Ottoman Empire and another Mamluk.
He's not as fascinating as the Butcher, right? He's not as fascinating as the Butcher?
Not quite, but still pretty respectable. He was born around 1750. He was imported as a slave, probably from the Caucasus region. I think the Georgians try to claim him as one of their own, and there are also other ideas that he might have been Circassian. Either way, he was raised as a Mamluk, rose through the ranks, and they had a joint chief system, so the guy running the civil government was Ibrahim Bey. Murad Bey inherited the title of Bey when he took over the military. He was seen as cruel and also imposing very heavy taxes, but also as energetic and courageous. So basically, he's sort of your stereotypical tyrant, kind of like the Butcher, but perhaps not as impressive.
Sounds less bloodthirsty. Sounds a little less bloodthirsty, though, right?
Yeah, although, I mean, I guess his subjects who were getting bled probably didn't feel that way necessarily. Although, I guess,
Yeah.
you know, people who live under tyrants probably tend to bitch about their local tyrant and see them as the absolute worst.
Of course, you know, to be fair, though, I remember reading that any French soldiers that he captured when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he had executed.
I would not be shocked.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd kind of, that's one of the things I'd read was that the French got there and then they would see that the prisoners, people would be rounded up, captured for whatever reason, right, would be executed and their bodies put on display. And of course, that only not only enrages the French soldiers, it makes it clear to them that they have to fight as hard as they can because there's no way that they're going to get a good deal. Which is why whenever somebody's like, let's not take any prisoners, I'm like, okay, good idea. Let's make sure the enemy fights really hard.
Also, I was reading a book of tactics by Polonius, who was talking about how there were a number of generals who refused to corner enemies, even though they could possibly get a complete destruction of the army, because the fear is that if you force them to fight desperately, you might turn a victory into a defeat.
Would that be the case of what happened to Boudica, her last battle?
Yeah, although the general also understood that and more or less allowed it to happen that way because he wanted to make sure his men were forced to plow through her army.
Yeah.
Anyway, with Murad Bey, he and his fellow Ibrahim were temporarily overthrown by an Ottoman expedition in 1786. They didn't regain power until 1791. I believe that it was that incident which gave Napoleon kind of his casus belli to go in to Egypt in the first place. After losing his two great battles at Shubrakit and the Pyramids, Napoleon offered Murad Bey the chance to surrender. He basically told Napoleon to go fuck himself. Napoleon goes on to invade the Levant and leaves Desai in charge of going to Upper Egypt to pursue Murad Bey, but Murad Bey evades him, refuses a decisive battle, continues to fight on a small scale, and later on he does make a peace deal with Kleber. However, right after making that deal, which would have allowed him to return to Cairo, he caught the bubonic plague and died.
Yeah, one thing I knew about him is that his sword, Napoleon had his sword, and it considered one of those prized personal possessions. They gave it to Marshal MacDonald in 1814. But outside of that, I don't have. I mean, most of what we know about him comes from the French, really. I know his tactics failed, but I don't know what else he was going to do. You know what I mean?
His military system was outdated. It was, you know, basically an almost medieval army trying to fight Napoleon's men.
Yeah, his idea to fight a guerrilla campaign seems to have been wise, but it doesn't seem like he carried it out very effectively.
No, I mean, he definitely didn't cripple Desai, but he did prevent Desai from completing the conquest of Egypt, and he denied him a decisive victory, which would have finished off the Mamluk military. So he was defiant. If anything, he reminds me sort of the Egyptian version of Marat or Ney or something like that. But I think his sort of spirit and resilience outweighed his actual talent. I don't get the impression that he was particularly capable. But, I mean, he definitely had perseverance. He not only managed to drive off the Ottomans in time, but also managed to outlast the French, at least until the bubonic plague took him. So, I mean, I don't think he's a very important opponent here. I mean, he's not the Butcher.
Yeah. He's also better than Mustafa Pasha, who was the commander of the Ottoman expedition to retake Egypt.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we don't know much about him, so I didn't even want to put him on the list. Yeah, I don't know. What do you want to rate him?
Maybe a gentleman's D- just for effort and perseverance.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I feel like that's pretty fair.
Well, we're going to close off our list with a pair of Russians, right?
Yep, we have two more Russians. First up is Pavel, I don't know how the hell to say his name, Chichagov?
No, the T is silent.
Chichagov?
Yeah. T is actually a leftover from French spellings of Russian names. So sometimes you'll see Tchaikovsky's name with a T or a C. The first letter of his last name, that is, and how people feel. I just like having the T in front, A complete and utter Anglophile. He actually studied the Royal Navy, married an English woman. And for that, Paul I imprisoned him.
Wow, what a terrible crime.
Yeah, so anyway, he was a favorite of Alexander I, and then he was put in charge of the Russian Navy. Now, when he was reforming the Russian Navy, who do you think he tried to copy?
I'm going to guess the British.
That'd be right. 1812, he was put in charge of an army against Napoleon. He was known for being slow and unsteady. Failed to interrupt Napoleon's retreat across the Brezina River. In fact, in general, was very, very cautious. This led him to be disgraced afterwards. The Russians didn't want to blame Kutuzov. They blamed him for Napoleon escaping. Eventually, he was able to win the most coveted goal of his life. He became a citizen of the British Empire.
So which of these Russian generals was the most responsible for fighting against Ney's rearguard, if any of them?
That would be Kutuzov, and Milodorovich in particular, although he's not on the list because he was ever an independent commander against Napoleon. But Milodorovich fought a lot with Ney, rearguard. By the way, I give this guy, Pavel Chikov, I give him an F.
Yeah, he sounds kind of shit.
Yeah, when I studied the Russian retreat, I was like, this guy's an idiot.
Also, by the time he encountered the French, wasn't this close to the end of the campaign when the army is pretty finished?
Yeah, I mean, he held the southern flank, but the Austrians really weren't pressing too much. So in a lot of ways, I mean, essentially his army just played with itself during the campaign.
Also, I remember reading that Schwarzenberg, actually as the Austrian commander in Russia, won a couple of minor battles. Were they at the expense of this guy?
I believe so.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Schwarzenberg necessarily, but if you get your ass kicked twice by Schwarzenberg and then allow a devastated army to escape, you do suck. I mean, I think it's safe to say.
Oh man.
Last,
yeah,
and I assume not least, Peter Wittgenstein.
I do want to mention one thing about Pavel Chikov. He just owed his position to Alexander I's favor, and because Russia was allying itself with Britain, it seemed like a good idea to be like, hey, Britain, we really are your friends. Look, this guy who's really into Britain is now going to command an army.
So, I mean, like, was his obsession with Britain bad enough that he was the equivalent of a modern weeaboo?
Yeah, except, one of those kind of people who has a Union Jack flag and a blue police call box, and they've asked them what their favorite authors are. They're like, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, J.K. Rowling. Dude,
yeah, we have a person who lives near us. We go through the neighborhood and see their house a lot, and they have one of those Doctor Who telephone booths. And I imagine if you knocked on the door of that person and asked them their favorite authors, they'd probably tell you exactly what you just said.
Oh, I mean, to be honest, I'm gonna be fair though. I am like a light Anglophile, so I'm just not one who's not gonna admit that sometimes the British are bollocks, right? But I mean, this guy's just silly about it,
Fair enough. So far we have more people in the F tier than any other tier.
Yeah, I mean, Napoleon did face some boobs,
Do you think that he faced people who sucked, or that they just sucked in comparison with him?
No, I mean, like, we've actually been very nice compared to other historians. We've been nicer to the Austrian generals he fought in Italy, and I'm not an expert in the Italian campaign, but I read enough to where I was like, the Austrian generals in Italy, they weren't bad, they were just average and elderly, and some of them, like I think Wurmser actually had some talent. But, I mean, Osterdat's a complete disaster. Mack had been hit in the head and was promoted way beyond his abilities. This guy's an admiral, okay? He's being put in charge of an army, which he has almost no experience commanding. And then you have Alexander himself. So, I mean, plays a part, doesn't it? You're going to have more success against idiots. I mean, think about it. if we're going to the S to the B tier, we're actually dealing with people who beat Napoleon. Archduke Charles, Wellington, Blucher, I'm sorry, not Murad Bey, no, the Butcher, right? These guys actually beat Napoleon. So I really feel like all the military geniuses I've read about, Napoleon really did get a wide spread of commanders from the very best to the very worst.
Yeah.
But I got to say, all the generals on this list, this guy, this Pavel Chikov, he is the worst.
All right, so that's quite an honor considering how bad a few of these guys have been.
Yeah.
So, did Napoleon ever write about this guy later? Did he even remember that he existed?
I've never run into him ever talking about him, you know?
Yeah, imagine there was a report. We realized there's a General Chikov nearby with some army. It might cut us off, but it apparently disappeared somewhere. We don't know.
I almost didn't put him on the list, but then I was like, wait, he was the Brezina, and the Brezina is important. If this guy had been on top of it, he could have just captured Napoleon. There you go, war over. You know? But no, we got to have a few more years of bloodshed.
Yep, good job, Pavel.
And by the way, Pavel, it's not like Kutuzov, who's also kind of like, he's wary of Napoleon, and he also says, maybe I want Napoleon to escape. No, Pavel does want to capture Napoleon. He just doesn't know how to do it.
Oh. Well. So what about our final commander, Peter Wittgenstein?
Yeah, Wittgenstein of German descent. Who knows? Maybe he's related to the philosopher who came about 100 years later. But anyway, this made him kind of unpopular with the Slavic officers. Remember, there's that kind of stuff going on in the Russian army. That kind of hurt Barclay de Tolly as well. He's mainly gained his fame for defeating the French in a series of battles along the Vina River, which threatened Napoleon's flank and retreat. Now, the Brezina, we're talking about how Chikov failed, Kutuzov failed. Wittgenstein tried hard and almost did capture Napoleon. So when the campaign's over, Wittgenstein becomes a big hero in Russia. And for that reason, he was also instrumental in getting the Prussians to defect. Alexander I was like, okay, this guy's won some battles, Kutuzov's dead, I'm going to put him in charge. But guess what happens? A whole bunch of Russian generals undermine him, such as Milodrovich, Barclay, some other guys we haven't talked about, like Platov, who usually commanded the Cossacks, and a variety of other officers. They undermined him, and he was beaten at Lutzen and Bautzen. And because he was defeated in those two big battles, he was demoted to Corps Command. And he actually did very well in Corps Command. Wittgenstein seems to have been a pretty good commander overall. The main problem is he was undermined by his fellow Russian generals. And when he did finally face Napoleon in some battles, he was facing a Napoleon who, okay, he's not commanding the best armies ever, but he's a re-energized Napoleon, ready to go. Lutzen and Bautzen are not great Napoleonic victories, but this is when Napoleon is at his strongest in 1813. So, a little hard to rate him. I'd probably say, I want to say a C or a D. What do you think?
I mean, I guess granted, given that he was being undermined actively, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and go with a C.
Okay. He did, like I said, he did well on the Vina River, and he did almost bag Napoleon of the Brezina. I mean, he gave it a real try, and he got close, you know?
So I guess, was nationalism starting to take hold in some form in Russia where the Russian commanders didn't want to follow the commands of a foreigner? Or was it something along those lines?
Something like that. I mean, you always have certain groups that want to get favored treatment, right? But I've sort of feel that a lot of nationalism in Europe at this time, beyond France, was also stronger on the peripheries of Europe, such as Britain and Russia. Yeah. But there definitely were, like, Russian armies divided into so many cliques, right? Like, are you Slavic or are you non-Slavic? Like that Paul was murdered or you don't like that Paul was murdered? How do you feel about our Tsar? How did Suvorov feel about you? I mean...
Yeah, the whole Suvorov and Tsar Paul questions remind me of every time there's a Republican primary, they always have a debate about who was the most Reagan-esque.
I think that really hit its height in 2012, remember?
Oh my god, that was every debate was just a competition to see who was the most like Reagan. And who could mention his name the most times.
I think, though, that's not going to happen in the future.
I hope not. The Democratic debates this time were also an Obama name-dropping competition at a lot of points.
It was fun about that, too. There was a guy, Paul Edward Gottfried, actually wrote a fun article about that because, the first debate or two, they were really hard on Obama. And he actually wrote a brief article where he said, like, yeah, this won't last. Obama polls really high amongst Democrats. And what do you know? After that debate, like, all the Democrats like, oh, no, Obama was awesome, man. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Drone strikes are fine when it's a black guy doing it. As Cornel West would say.
Yeah.
More eloquent words,
I remember the dumbest thing I've ever heard, not to get too far into this, but Trevor Noah was saying that the people who are calling Obama corrupt for getting Wall Street speeches after his presidency are just being racist because he too should be allowed to sell out the corporations and make money. And he said this unironically, and it was not supposed to be a joke or tongue-in-cheek.
Well, I mean, no surprise, man. The Democratic Party has taken a hard turn towards corporatism.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, I mean, yeah, we're not doing a political video here, but speaking not as somebody who's interested in who's going to win politically, but I think thinking more historically, the trends do point towards the Democratic Party becoming a hard corporate party. There's actually a guy who predicted that in 2016, and I keep rereading that article, and I'm like, I think this guy nailed it. He said that the political alignments are changing, and the Democratic Party is set to become the pro-business party.
That's my nightmare scenario, is you have a Democratic Party, which is 1,000,000% corporate, and a Republican Party, which, goes hard right on social issues. So then you have two parties, which in very different ways are completely and totally horrid.
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence for that, man. I don't know what to say.
Yeah. Anyway, let's talk about some of our upcoming ideas. So
Okay.
I guess the next one we do will be on the factions of World War II, looking at the armies, navies, and air forces of 8 of the major factions.
Yeah, so you don't want to do Romania and Finland like you mentioned earlier?
I mean, I would be okay with doing those. Obviously, if we put them in, they will be discussed much more briefly than the other powers.
If you're doing those, then you got to do like Poland and Canada because they contributed more troops than Finland.
Yeah, I mean, didn't Canada put all their men under British command, though?
I mean, overall British command, sure, but I mean, Canadians contribute a lot of soldiers. By the way, people are surprised to learn that. I'm like, yeah, the Canadians in the World Wars did really well. Of course, the Canadian Navy played a big role in the Battle of the Atlantic. Can't speak too much about the Canadian Air Force, but that was kind of the thing we were talking about, is that the Air Forces in World War II pretty well.
Yeah, the fleets.
I know the fleet stuff really well, and we both know enough about the Army to get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, if we did want to add those, maybe you could do Canada, and then I could do Romania and Finland. And then,
I don't
keep it really brief for those, like a 5-minute spiel.
My opinion is, if you were not invited to like some kind of major conference, you know what I'm trying to say, then I'm not like in other words, like Finland is not planning Barbarossa with the Germans. The Romanians know it's coming, some detail, but they're not right there planning maneuvers except for where it affects them, right? In the case of the Allies, I mean, usually it's who's at a conference table, right? Britain, America, Soviet Union. Cairo conference, though, Chiang Kai-shek is there. And, of course, the French, for understandable reasons, were given one of the occupations of Germany.
Yeah, and also I guess the Chinese also contributed a massive amount of manpower and also tied up a whole hell of a lot of Japanese troops.
Exactly. So I think China's worth including. I kind of debated it, but I think China's worth including.
Yeah, I can't wait for your lengthy discussion of the Chinese fleet. That should be a lot of fun.
Spoilers: their ships see more action in the Japanese Navy than they do in the Chinese Navy.
Yeah, also the Chinese Air Force discussion will be rather brief. Although the Army discussion will be pretty interesting. Their Army's pretty damn interesting, not for necessarily the best reasons, but they do some weird stuff. Not to mention the factionalism within China at the time. And then, so basically we have the US, USSR, UK, China, Japan, Germany, Italy, and France. Those are the big 8 that we're covering.
Yeah, and when we do France, by the way, I mean, we're going to mention them. We're not doing Vichy France because technically Vichy France was neutral. So we'll be kind of combining France both as an ally and then Free France as well.
Okay, I didn't know we were going to talk about Free France too.
Yeah, I'm going to consider Free France in that discussion.
All right, fair enough.
Whatever their contribution be. For all the Francophiles out there, we are talking about France, and we will be talking about France in World War II, which is known as France's complete low point. As opposed to what we're talking about right now, which is France's military at its heights.
Yeah, although I think that sometimes the French military from World War II does get underrated to some extent.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in some detail. They had some very good ship designs for sure.
They also had a few good aircraft designs too, at least in the fighter department.
Yeah, actually, I would say the D-520 was slightly superior to your Messerschmitt and your Spitfire. Of course, pilot training is more important at that point. But I mean, the French Air Force was in the middle of revamping. Yes. D-520 was a very good airplane. But anyway, we'll be talking about that when we get there. We're going to do that one next, and then we'll do the German generals and then the Allied ones as well, right?
Right. And I guess the Allied ones, it seems like there might be more Soviets than anybody else, but I guess that makes sense if you think about how many troops they threw into the war.
Yeah, the ones I put on the list, by the way, too, for you, some of them, debatably, we should probably have more Soviets when we do the list. But there are a few British generals like Dempsey and O'Connor that I wanted to discuss, because I think they're worth discussing.
Right. So I guess what we could do is put up a poll after the factions video to see if people want Axis or Allied generals first.
That sounds good. That sounds good.
But
no, man, it's been a fun discussion talking about Napoleon's opponents and how almost even. I don't know about even, but he's got a wide spread of enemies here.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's a large variety of skills on display here, and some of the skills I have had to put in scare quotes.
Yeah, I think you're surprised at how incompetent the Russian Russian high command is, right?
Well, I mean, so I'd read about Austerlitz and some of their other battles, so I'm not totally stunned. That being said, I didn't know much about Kutuzov. I mean, I always figured that he must be reasonably competent, but I guess he was just a subordinate of General Winter, riding the coattails.
I will say my take on Kutuzov is my hot take of the Napoleonic Wars. The fact that I think he's below average.
Fair enough. Yeah, so far you've had a number of hot takes on these, and very few people have gotten pissed off.
I will say this about Kutuzov, though. I do not mean incompetent. He is not Mac or Pavel, all right? Chukov. Like a Chukov, or I can't fucking pronounce it. The Admiral guy. He's not like those guys.
I think he's Chichagov or something like that.
Probably Chichikov. I'm about to say Chekhov over here like we're watching Star Trek or something.
Yeah, no, it's not Chekhov. Oh, there is a Star Trek novel, by the way, where Chekhov is transported back in time, and he's a World War II soldier, and he meets Stalin, and Stalin assumes that he is related to Chuikov.
Oh, the Russian general from Stalingrad.
Yeah, and apparently Chuikov also thinks that he must be some long-lost nephew or cousin, and becomes his friend and mentor.
Interesting.
Yeah, so anyway, it's kind of a spin-off. I forget which one it is, but I have it on my stack of Star Trek books in the corner somewhere.
I did send a picture of Chuikov from Operation Europe. And even though, arguably, I mean, he never commanded more than an army in the war, I think he's worth discussing because he was such an integral army commander.
In the Downfall movie, you remember the one where they're in Hitler's bunker? Isn't Chuikov the Soviet general they show when they're trying to negotiate, and he's just staring at them blankly? Like, what do you not understand? We're going to crush you. There is not going to be any kind of negotiated settlement.
Yeah, well, I mean, Krebs really wasn't going to them to, like, negotiate a settlement. He was just like, hey, what's the terms of surrender? You know? Which I know, seems ridiculous to us, but I guess for Krebs, I mean, he's trying to do something. Anyway, then he shot himself anyway,
Yeah.
One of the reasons they chose Krebs, though, is Krebs could speak Russian.
Oh. Well, I guess, too, I just love that expression on Chuikov's face in that scene, though. He's just like, why are you wasting my time? You already know the conditions. It has to be unconditional surrender. We already established this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, before I head out, you got any opinions on Napoleon's opponents now that we're done?
By and large, I would have to say they seem like a less impressive cast of men than the marshals.
Yeah, I would agree.
Although I guess it doesn't take into account a lot of the subordinates who these guys had, because some of them were pretty good.
Yes, and at the same time, a lot of the subordinates from these guys are quite bad, especially in the Austrian and especially in the Russian army. And you have people actively undermining you.
Yeah, although the Russians did have Konstantin Pavlovich, so he was like their secret weapon. The Russian Guard under him was basically the 10th Legion.
Yeah, it should be noted too with somebody like Blücher. One of the reasons I gave him a B was he did become like this rallying force within the Prussian army. Like, he's I mean, bickering really did hurt Hohenlohe and Brunswick. But, I mean, and there's always going to be some level of bickering. But under Blücher, you don't have the Prussians sniping each other the way you have in some of the other ones. A lot of that does have to do with Blücher. So just it's an important way. If it's an important thing to do if you're going to be winning. It's very rare to run into an army that's victorious, where officers are openly bickering and have opposing camps that are trying to undermine. By the way, I don't mean that there's never anything such as command tensions. You get what I'm trying to say here.
Right.
I'd probably rate the Russian army, the Napoleonic Wars, as one of the most dysfunctional armies of the Musket era. But anyway, so there's some opinions, everybody. You want to go ahead and close things up, Derek?
Yeah, so that is all for tonight. When we come back, probably in about a week or so, we will cover the factions of World War II, look at the armies, navies, and air forces, and then we'll get into some World War II generals, and who knows what we'll do after that. So until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Peace out.